and Budget. Mr. Eddie Garcia is running late. His flight is delayed, so I will be chairing of the hearing until he gets here. To start, we have some housekeeping items to go over. We encourage everyone to practice physical distancing. As a reminder to the public, this committee accepts in-person public testimony. To make time for every person waiting to comment, we will limit public testimony to 1 minute per person. If you are unable to appear in person today, you may file written comments to the email address on the committee website. We are meeting today to discuss the topic of midterm actions needed for the energy transition. While this is very broad, our focus today will be on renewable energy resource development to meet our 2030 goals. We have authorized several budget and allocated funding in future year money to support a clean energy reliability investment plan that the CEC will present in March of 2023, and to help identify actions that support near and midterm reliability while reducing greenhouse gases. Each of these actions alone would be recognized as some of the biggest pieces of energy policy in the past decade. Taken together, it marks a monumental investment in our clean energy future, a future that we all support as the state continues to battle the effects of climate change, such as that of heat waves that continue to roll through the summer, and every summer will be continuing to roll through. But the purpose of this hearing is to assess with a focus on 2030 what actions have been taken by the state agencies to date to meet our energy transition, what additional planning and action might be necessary, and to hear from outside experts their vision for meeting the energy transition. This hearing will provide a broad overview of the vision of 2030 and present challenges and opportunities that will be explored in other hearings and other committees in the future, including transmission and distribution planning, the impacts of electrifying the transportation sector, and the evolution of the natural gas sector. With that, I would like to invite my colleagues to provide opening remarks. I'll start with our Budget Chair, Assemblymember Phil Ting.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is the hearing that is a follow-up from our budget hearing that we had a couple months ago in August. There are still a number of questions that remain unanswered that we'd like to try to get a clearer handle on. I think there was a significant amount of concern in the legislature as we were looking at emergency energy supply, that there was an over-reliance on fossil fuel. There was a lack of really articulation of future clean energy purchases. And at a time when we are moving toward our 2050 goal of 100% renewable energy, it seemed odd to retreat to fossil fuels and to use that as a crutch when we are the center of the green and clean energy revolution, not just in the country, but really in the entire world. When we have so many companies here, so much innovation going on, that has seemed a really opportune time to double down and to invest in those technologies. So I think there was a number of questions which we're not able to answer in August. I think it's an opportunity for the administration to address many of those questions today in terms of long-term clean energy resources. Which resources are we really going to be heavily investing in over the next 5 to 10 years, as well as looking at innovative technology like demand response that we could really utilize in a pinch, but also understanding that climate change is here. Climate change is altering our reality, whether it's wildfires or drought, and understanding that impacts our energy grid, that impacts our ability to generate hydroelectricity. It impacts, it increases the demand for backup storage because now so many folks who are impacted by wildfires and power shutoffs are looking at backup storage on their own, going off the grid in some ways or partially going off the grid when they need to. So many of these items, unfortunately, weren't discussed in any great fashion, even as we were really moving through a very large $1.6 billion proposal that involved keeping a very old nuclear power plant open. So, today we look at this as the beginning of the conversation, not a one and done conversation. I think we're hopeful that the administration is coming forward with certain answers that unfortunately we didn't get any answers in August. So very much look forward to this hearing and look forward to, again, the dialogue and the partnership. And, we'll cede it back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to invite Assemblymember Fong to give opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly appreciate the attention on this issue. I think that when we talk about energy and the reality of our energy challenges as a state, I think they aren't going away. I think they're only going to intensify. And when we talk about reliability and affordability, those are real issues that we're going to address, and we have to address. And I think we have to be pragmatic and realistic. I certainly may have a different perspective of those on the dais, but I think we need to have an honest assessment of how we actually deal with these core issues and figure out a way to address them in a way that puts Californians first, especially when we talk about how do we keep the lights on. We have to look at fossil fuel generation, natural gas generation. We have to look at the value of Diablo Canyon. I think what we saw with the flex alerts in the summer and the debate in front of the legislature about the extension of Diablo Canyon, I think it revealed a reality that we're going to have to look at all sources of energy production to keep the lights on. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Fong. Well, I look forward to hearing from the panelists on how we can prepare for long-term clean energy reliability while making sure that these costs don't fall on working Californians. But so with that, we're ready to get started. Our first panelist will be CEC Vice Chair Gunda. He'll start us off.
Good morning. Good morning, chairs and members and public participants here. I'm Siva Gunda, Vice Chair of the California Energy Commission. For the record, I just wanted to go through some opening comments before we answer your questions as a panel here. Thank you for the opportunity to provide opening comments to you and your committees on midterm actions needed for the energy transition. Electricity system reliability continues to be one of the most critical priorities of the CEC, CPUC, and CAISO. Members, before I talk about the specific actions that we have taken collectively as agencies, I want to elevate how all the actions we have taken since 2020 have helped us navigate a much harder situation than 2020 and 2022. Just to provide you a high-level stat, we were nearly 6,000 megawatts higher than what we experienced during the blackouts in 2020, and we were still able to get through that without a blackout, thanks to you, the legislature, and the administration for all the tools and the support you have provided us over the last several years. Over the last 2 years, we have substantially expanded our collective collaboration and taken full advantage of our collective authorities to plan for the most critical summer months that test grid reliability. Better incorporating climate change into our planning, ordered an unprecedented level of new clean resources, effectively increasing and planning increasing our planning reserve margin, identified and built out additional emergency resources, and many other things. As we noted at the beginning of the summer, CEC and CAISO's analysis showed that we could have a shortfall as much as 1,700 megawatts this summer. If you add in the potential for extreme heat, as we saw in 2020, and wildfires experienced in 2021, we could have had 7,000 megawatts shortfall, is what our analysis showed, and that's nearly where we landed this summer. This summer, you and the governor took bold steps to make available an unprecedented level of resources and authorities over the next decade to support California's grid reliability, affordability, and transition to clean energy. AB 205 established the Strategic Reliability Reserve, which was essential to ensuring reliability this summer, and the option of opt-in permitting in recognition of unprecedented build-out of clean energy required for reliability under SB 100 goals. AB 209 funds multiple clean energy programs to invest in important strategies to reach our clean energy goals through building decarbonization, offshore wind, and invest in development of clean energy technologies through Climate Innovation Program. SB 846 enables the state to evaluate whether extending Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant is prudent to provide grid reliability. This summer, we were again faced with ongoing extreme drought conditions and an extended and extreme heat unlike anything we have ever seen before for a September month, especially since August 31st. That lasted from August 31st to September 9th. September 6th was our worst day. The expected 1 in 2 demand forecast, or the median forecast for September 2022, was approximately 44,600 megawatts. And we were on a track to get to 53,000 megawatts this summer, which would have put us about 7,000 megawatts higher than what we've anticipated. And you all experienced what has happened on September 6th. We were on track for the 53,000 megawatts before demand-side load reductions were called on, including a wireless emergency alert, which went out to 27 million Californians in counties with high electricity use patterns during the net peak. CAISO system ultimately experienced a high of 52,000 megawatts. Load has topped 50,000 megawatts only twice in the ISO's history, when it reached 50,116 megawatts in September 2017 and 50,270 megawatts in July 2006. Based on historical data, this would put the event at a 1 in 27 heat event or a weather event using 30 years of data, or 1 in 14 using 20 years data, just to give you what's happening there. As you take fewer and fewer years for historical analysis, we are seeing that this is becoming more and more normal. Preliminary analysis suggests we would have needed to plan for nearly a 30% cushion, significantly higher than what our practices are today, to get through a day such as September 6th. By saying a 30% cushion, we do not suggest that this be entirely procured by the LSCs, but collectively LSC procurement, the strategic reserve, real-time imports, and other contingencies, such as balancing area support and emergency load production programs, are needed to support such levels of cushion. As challenging as it was for the grid, we were fortunate in multiple ways. We had relatively low outage rates of our fleet from existing generation during the worst days of the event. There were minimal wildfires to the electrical infrastructure, despite the fact that there were multiple wildfires in the vicinity of electrical infrastructure in California and Pacific Northwest in the time period. CAL FIRE and other firefighting agencies did an outstanding job in monitoring and protecting critical infrastructure. Coordination and collaboration within California and across the West resulted in strong imports and emergency assistance going both to and from CAISO during this event. While the heat event affected the entire West, it was not extreme at the same time throughout the region. For example, the Pacific Northwest experienced high temperatures early on, but was able to provide additional exports when California needed mostly. There was a concerted effort across the state to support the grid during the heat wave. We have very close coordination among Governor's Office, CEC, CPUC, CAISO, DWR, and Cal OES. The Governor's Office led the development of statewide playbook, leveraging the CAISO's playbook for operational needs in advance of the summer for such events, and initiated the playbook during the summer event. The governor issued an emergency proclamation on August 31st, enabling emergency resources to be activated during the crisis. We are working to quantify the impacts of particular efforts, but at a high level, the strategic reserve was able to bring approximately 1,600 megawatts DWR generators and contracts for imports, brought on new supply, and CEC's demand-side grid support program, which provide load reduction. Customer load reduction through the Flex Alert and Wireless Emergency Alert made a substantial reduction in the load. CPUC's emergency load reduction program, like the ELRP, reduced load in CAISO territory. DWR maximized hydroelectric generation and minimized pumping demands from the State Water Project. DGS curtailed energy use across state facilities, including a warm shutdown in 25 buildings, setting temperatures to 85 degrees, and shifted to backup generators in other facilities. We will be providing a much more extensive overview for the summer in the reliability report as requested in AB 205, which will be provided on January 31st. We will also provide preliminary analysis of California's reliability situation for the next decade in our report in December, as required by SB 846. We will expand on the analysis in the AB 205 report with a focus on midterm reliability. These analyses will include projections of resources expected to be added to the grid, the most up-to-date demand forecasts, including anticipated electrification. We're also in the process of developing clean energy reliability investment plan as called for in SB 846, will support grid reliability and deployment of clean energy resources and load reduction resources. The plan will lay out proposed initiatives for funding to further strengthen our grid and reliability through 2035. The plan will be informed by public comment and will be provided to you by March of next year. We released a request for information last Monday as our first opportunity for public input on the technologies and approaches to consider in the plan, and we will provide more opportunities for public input before we adopt the plan at a business meeting and bring it back to you. The strategies in the plan will be aligned to support the key policies that some of you laid out in your comments today. It's laid out in the legislation, supporting the loading order, reduce demand during the net peak load, support near and midterm reliability, and support the state's greenhouse gas goals. We also will look to ensure the strategies are complementary to other ongoing and newly funded programs established by the legislature, supporting California's most adversely affected by the state's existing fossil resources, as well as supporting affordability. Thank you again for this opportunity to provide an opening statement. I will now turn to my colleague Pete Scala from CPUC, and then he'll be followed by Delphine Ho from CAISO. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good morning, Assembly members. My name is Pete Scala, and I'm the Director of Electric Supply, Procurement, and Costs at the California PUC in the Energy Division. Thank you for this opportunity to provide you with a status update of the PUC's energy resource development efforts. Two recent PUC integrated resource planning decisions ordered PUC jurisdictional load-serving entities to procure new resources that will provide 14,800 megawatts of net qualifying capacity, which represents the amount of energy that a resource can deliver during peak periods when energy demand is the highest. All 11,500 megawatts of resources in the second order were required to be clean energy resources. And so far, for the first order, the 3,300 megawatts are turning out to proving to be mostly batteries. So essentially, almost all of those megawatts will be clean energy resources, and that represents almost 1/3 of the current PUC jurisdictional peak load. These 12,800 of those megawatts are required to come online between 2021 and 2025, and the remaining 2,000 are requested to be online by 2026, but those are long lead time resources, and the decision ordering them recognized that there are a little more challenges with those resources. So provided that the entities provide a showing of a good faith effort, they do have like a 2-year period to actually bring those online. And I bring that up just because I think it's important to stress that we're not going to get all of this done with batteries, solar, and wind. We're going to need some other resources, and they're going to involve new technologies that could take some additional time, or they may need new transmission to resource-rich areas. And so we need to, in recognition of that, there was a little more grace period for those new resources, those types of resources. There are also, in addition to those, there are still resources coming online that were already envisioned and included in our baseline when we ordered those. So things like the renewable portfolio standard resources that were already in play and battery storage mandate resources. So those will be in addition to these new 14,800 megawatts. And then in addition to that, speaking to the summer reliability challenges we've had of late, there's in the PUC's summer reliability decision, we directed the utilities, the investor-owned utilities, to endeavor to procure another 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts of resources that are available at summer peak periods for 2022 and 2023. These summer reliability resources include the new Emergency Load Reduction Program, which has enrolled over 4 million customers that represent 900 megawatts of potential load reductions to procure additional import. It also provided authority to procure additional imports, which provided over 1,000 megawatts of incremental resources during the highest load days this past September, and a number of new programs and pilot efforts, including new demand response programs, new dynamic rates, a smart thermostat program, new microgrid authorizations, and additional funding for the Flex Alert program. It takes several months to develop preliminary estimates of the performance of load reduction and demand response programs, and additional time to perform more thorough analyses by individual provider, customer class, how the performance over time as the heat event persisted, et cetera. So while we know that many megawatts of load reduction resources were triggered by the CAISO during that event, we don't yet know how they performed, but we will certainly consider whether and how to improve these programs based on those performance results once the market settlement data is in hand. Finally, I'll note that any new resources being procured by load-serving entities not under PUC jurisdiction, which within CAISO make up another 10% of the load, and outside of CAISO another 25% in California, any of those resources would be additional to what I'm reporting here. In terms of focusing on the new resources that have achieved commercial operationalization so far, since January 2020, over 4,000 megawatts of clean new resources have been added to the CAISO grid, a large amount of which has been energy storage that can provide energy during the critical net peak hours as the sun is setting. In addition to these new steel-in-the-ground resources, the IOUs achieved very close to the top of the 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts target, that the summer reliability proceeding target in September, this past September. To get these unprecedented amount of clean resources online in the required timeframes, project developers are currently facing a number of challenges, which largely fall into three categories: supply chain, interconnection, and permitting. On the supply chain side, there are a lengthy list of issues that have affected the new resources supply chain, and these issues may resolve on different timelines. The market is responding to supply chain issues in different ways. For instance, the U.S. Department of Commerce investigation of the Oxen solar petition caused a severe disruption for nearly all solar panels this past spring and summer. In June, the Biden administration provided a 2-year reprieve through June 2024, but we're still waiting for the outcome of that investigation, which could add significant new tariffs to the solar and solar plus projects being developed, solar plus storage projects being developed in California. Projects have also faced manufacturing disruptions with COVID-19 related shutdowns impacting battery manufacturing in China, as well as disruptions in the shipping market. Sometimes there are delays in port offloading, but we also have seen challenges and changes in shipping regulations that impact the types of ships that can carry batteries and the amount of batteries that can be loaded on individual ships. Like the rest of the economy, we know that all parts of the supply chain have experienced limited availability and inflationary pressures, not just on panels and batteries, but also on cement, transformers, and other balance of plant equipment. Price increases in project components can make projects unviable for developers, making it more costly for them to complete the project at the negotiated price versus just defaulting on the contract and losing their deposits. And many developers have sought price renegotiations as a result of the inflationary pressures and revised online dates as a result of supply chain issues. The Inflation Reduction Act came not a moment too soon to help some of those price increases experienced by developers as they bring their projects to fruition. The second set of challenges facing developers relate to grid interconnection process. There are a lot of time and resource-intensive steps that need to be performed to get interconnection studies, agreements, and equipment itself in place so that a new resource can come online and deliver energy reliably. Finally, the third set of challenges are related to permitting in general, but especially the permitting of large-scale battery projects as local permitting agencies and fire marshals familiarize themselves with this relatively new technology. The CEC has been supporting these efforts of late, and they also have launched a new permitting program which will provide an optional alternate pathway for some projects. The PUC has been coordinating with other state and local entities to address these different challenges. Early this spring, to help ensure that these resources were brought online as quickly as possible, the PUC spearheaded the development of a new Tracking Energy Development Task Force, TED Task Force, which is a joint effort with PUC, CEC, CAISO, and the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. And currently, GoBiz is now coordinating that task force. The objective of the task force is to track new energy projects that are in development and provide development support as appropriate for individual projects, or identify barriers and coordinated actions across the agencies that can help projects writ large. The priority focus of the TED task force has been projects that come online in the next 1 to 3 years. In terms of what we've seen, some projects have sought last-minute assistance with interconnection, permitting, shipping, or construction challenges, and reiterating the importance of pushing these normal construction complexities to key stakeholders so that projects can reach completion and serve reliability has been extremely helpful in getting these projects completed online. In some cases, it's flagging to a specific agency that the ball's in their court, or writing letters in support of permit extensions to work outside of the typical time frame. So, a variety of different things that we've done to try to help move projects along that have been pretty successful so far. And finally, the CAISO and PUC have initiated the Transformation Development Forum to create a regular, transparent opportunity for stakeholders to track the status of transmission network upgrades that affect individual generators and all other transmission projects in general that are approved by the CAISO's transmission planning process. In these quarterly meetings, transmission owners provide status updates with a strong focus on delays and reasons for the delays and revised target completion dates, which help developers prioritize and sequence other components of their projects. Lastly, I want to mention that the PUC's efforts to keep electricity rates affordable for all customers while achieving our clean energy and reliability goals are critically important. In the annual SB 695 reports to the legislature, the PUC has highlighted rate trends and identified the cost drivers of electric rates, which are primarily wildfire mitigation investments, transmission infrastructure, and revenue shortfalls from the growth in behind-the-meter resources, as well as secondary cost drivers from transportation electrification investments and energy and capacity procurement for electric reliability. The PUC's affordability rulemaking adopted metrics to jointly track affordability issues for customers across the utility industries the CPUC regulates, and required the utilities to present affordability results in new requests for ratepayer expenditures. In addition, in coordination with the Office of Energy and Infrastructure Safety, the PUC is enhancing its review of wildfire mitigation costs in the IOU's general rate cases. In addition, as you are aware, the legislature recently appropriated another $1.2 billion for a second round of California arrearage payment program funding. And you also passed AB 205, which directs the PUC to implement income-graduated fixed charges for residential rates to address equity issues as more customers electrify and invest in distributed energy resources. Last week, the PUC administrative law judge, or a PUC law judge, released for comment a new proposed decision modernizing the net energy metering tariff to more closely align rate design with affordability objectives. The PUC is constantly balancing reliability and clean energy goals with customer bill affordability. We also recognize that it is becoming increasingly challenging as rate drivers compound, and we look forward to working with the legislature to develop additional policy tools and solutions. Thank you for the opportunity to provide you with information about the PUC's collaborative efforts to ensure new clean energy resources come online as quickly as possible to support grid reliability while also balancing costs. I will now pass the mic to my colleague Delphine Howe with the California Independent System Operator.
Minor height adjustment there. Good morning, Chair, members. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before your respective committees this morning. My name is Delphine Howe, Director of California Regulatory Affairs at the California Independent System Operator. As stated by Vice Chair Gunda and Director Scala already, the ISO has been working very closely with our energy agency partners and to ensure better coordination and alignment throughout the summer months, but also in all of the planning leading up to the critical summer months. As our Chief Operating Officer and Senior Vice President Mark Rothlier has stated before the Assembly Utilities and Energy Committee this past year, the alignment and increased coordination has been instrumental in preventing shortfalls and preparing for the near term. We just recently released our September report. It's the culmination of monthly reports that the CAISO publishes over the summer months, but this time around we have a very in-depth review of the events of early September as we understand them with the data that we have today. The goal is to provide increased transparency and a resource to understand how the grid is handling an ever-increasing demand for energy. The report is rich in content. It has many of the aspects that both Vice Chair Gunda and Director Scala spoke of, and we really appreciate all of their efforts in coordinating with us during that time. But during the September's record-setting heat wave, the ISO was able to keep electricity flowing without interruption because of some very specific factors that I wanted to point out. In addition to the many environmental factors that Vice Chair Gunda had gone through, for example, there was not as many wildfires as there was in 2020. The Pacific Northwest did have a cool down as we were going into the most critical peak heat period of our system. But in addition to those environmental factors, I do want to note, as Director Scala had mentioned, that we've had increased resource adequacy procurement since 2020, especially those resources that will be effective during the net peak when the sun sets and we still have a very keen need for electricity driven by large air conditioning loads. Specifically, we've added 3,500 megawatts of additional grid-connected battery storage since 2020. Today, we have about 4,400 megawatts of grid-connected battery storage in total. So as you can see, since 2020, this significant amount of that capacity was added in just 2 short years. And more is coming, as Director Scala had noted. And another factor is an improved coordination and communications with California utilities throughout the state, throughout our footprint, as well as state agencies, including the governor's office, and of course, our partners at the Public Utilities Commission and the California Energy Commission, enhanced coordination with other regional utilities and members of the Western Energy Imbalance Market. Another critical aspect is, since the 2020 outages, the market enhancements that we had been put in place were really put to the test this summer. And so those improvements greatly helped us weather through this additional heat wave in September. We also had the use of new state programs to provide non-market resources to address extreme events and other conservation efforts. Even though the California ISO does not control these resources, nor do we have visibility, in working with our partners, we were able to ensure that all of these resources kind of came to the fore to help out the grid. We also had very close coordination with the load-serving entities throughout the ISO's footprint during our highest emergency alert level of the event. We got very close to, but did not have to order rotating outages. But their coordination and cooperation with us, we are very thankful for that. Lastly, emergency assistance kept our energy flowing into and out of the CAISO grid, demonstrating the importance of resource sharing among collaborating electricity systems across the West. The early September events were were not only extreme, but they were unprecedented. The ISO issued flex alerts calling for voluntary conservation for a record 10 consecutive days. On September 6th, when the record temperatures were set throughout the California systems and the West, demand on the ISO, as Vice Chair Gunda mentioned, reached our all-time peak of 52,061 megawatts. And that was the peak during the middle of the day, and not to mention the challenging periods during the net peak as the sun was setting, but air conditioning load was still quite high. We also want to note that regional cooperation helped us greatly in maintaining reliability. That same evening of September 6th, we had net imports of 6,500 megawatts from neighboring providers, as well as on top of that, another 1,000 megawatts from the Western Energy Imbalance market. So those additional transfers in real time, again, sharing with our neighbors, proved critical in helping the ISO grid. As such, interruptions were avoided, but more of the ins and outs and lessons learned can be provided and gleaned through the report that we put out. It's a nail-biting 170-page thriller if you have the time to read it. But in summary, I'll just note that, with the increased frequency of heat waves across the West, we'll continue to have to grapple with demand for increased energy usage. What we found is that we do have many tools, but as Director Scala noted, some of the great tools that we have today, such as battery storage, has been effective, though we do need to continue to look to diversifying our portfolio and our clean energy resources to operate throughout all periods of the day and seasons on the grid. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you to all of you for your presentations. Next, I'll open it up to questions or comments from committee members. Okay, Mr. Fong.
Just a few questions. Thank you for the presentation. I'm not sure if this maybe goes to the Energy Commission or maybe it goes to CalISO, but I wanted to kind of get more specifics on the Strategic Energy Reserve. I think we've had this conversation before when it was going through the process, but can you flesh out now kind of what the assets are in the reserve?
Thank you, member, for the question. Yes, we have broadly what we were able to do this year, and then we have some ideas on the next several years. To begin with, as you know, there are three broad components to the funding that you provided us. One is the strategic reserve that the DWR is doing, and then there are two programs at CEC that were created. One is the demand side grid support program, which is an incentive program for emergency load reduction, and another one which is called the distributed generation assets program, which we're still in the process of standing up, that would provide a lot of clean backup generation and distributed assets. On the DWR side, we have multiple elements that make it. So one is the temporary gensets that DWR was able to stand up over the last couple of years. They were also able to fund a number of imports this year. And moving forward, there will be money spent on holding on to some of the previously planned retirement resources, including the OTC power plants. So that's the broad structure of it. Currently, based on the 205 requirements, DWR is in the process of coming to CEC's business meeting this month to provide details on what they're hoping to do, and we'll be reporting that in our next report.
So is the strategic reserve, is it functioning now?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And so going back, and I'll have to go back and read the 170 pages in the report in the summer, but when it was utilized in the summer, where did the power come from?
Yes, so a large amount was imports this summer. DWR funded nearly 1,000 megawatts of imports. There were temporary generators this year, both the ones that were installed last year but were leased this year. And with the DHGS program at CEC, we were able to top about 300 megawatts of grid side reductions.
And in terms of the imports, what is the makeup of the imports? What power was generated through the imports?
Yeah, I would like to defer to my colleague, POC.
Thank you. I believe the vast majority of those imports came from the Northwest.
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 And how was that power generated in Northwest?
It likely was largely hydroelectric.
Hydro. Okay. And so when we talk about, when I look at the Cal ISO website and it says imports, what does that mean? Is it hydro predominantly, or is it other aspects of it?
Thank you for the question. When we're looking at the imports table in particular, we don't provide a breakdown because that is the totality of the imports being brought into the CAISO. So it could be, as Director Scala mentioned, it could be hydro-based, but during the certain times of the day as well as the year, it could also be other assets. The marginal tends to be gas imported from the West, but it could be a blend across the resources that they're able to provide.
Okay. And then in terms of, I guess, projections, and maybe this goes back to the Energy Commission. I mean, you mentioned kind of September 6th as kind of the big day that we were kind of in a really bad spot. I mean, looking out now in the next, and I think you provided some insight on this in some of our hearings, but has those assessments changed? What is the projection for the state, say, in the next like 5 to 10 years? In terms of demand and supply.
Yeah, thank you, member. So I just want to use this opportunity to just set a level set on the demand forecast and the forecast that California Energy Commission does. So California Energy Commission provides a multitude of forecasts. One forecast is called the 1 in 2, which is a median forecast. But along with that, we also create and adopt a few other forecasts that are looking at extreme weather conditions. So, for example, this year, the levels that we've experienced was adopted as a forecast under high conditions, which was about 1 in 20 forecast. So that's 52,700. So we continue to provide them as we move forward into the future. I think a couple of areas to elevate and highlight for you. What we're beginning to observe is that the median forecast is not changing that much. So it's roughly 1 to 2% growth year after year in the median forecast, and generally the median numbers when you look back in a year are right there. But what's happening is, given this high level temperatures we're observing, the tails are stretching, and stretching really really far. So the question then becomes, how do you cover those tails in an affordable manner? So previously, before the last 3 years, we typically accounted for those tails with a 15% planning reserve margin on the top of what we looked at as a median forecast. That would be harder to cover moving forward, and that's something that we are working on, how best to accommodate those tails using a combination of existing procurement, but also the tools that you provided us in terms of strategic reserve and such.
And so part of the addressing the tails is the reserve.
Yes.
Now, you did mention some of the retirement assets that no longer are being retired. So can you give me some examples of contracts that were extended out or assets that were supposed to phase out that weren't?
Yes. So we are looking at the OTC power plants, which are roughly 4,000 megawatts. And that process of extending them is a two-part process. One is we need the State Water Board to allow us to do so. And then DWR has to negotiate the contracts to be a part of that. It's currently underway. The DWR is negotiating extension of some of these and having some early talks.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Right now, those current extensions that go through next year. So what the extensions that Vice Chair Gunda is referring to would start in 2024.
So I think you outlined this this challenge is that you've got some battery storage coming online in 21 to 25, and then some in 26. Though you did say that we can't, of course, address the shortfall completely by battery storage. Can you kind of elaborate on that in terms of is there new technologies on the horizon that you're looking at, or you're hoping that it's going to be online, or can you kind of flesh that out a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, there are two categories of additional resources that were ordered by the Commission, those long lead time resources. And there are 2,000 megawatts. 1,000 were referred to as clean, firm generation, right? So it's not a battery that's just storing and then sort of shifting in time when energy is delivered. It actually has to be new electrons that are generated in a clean, firm manner. Traditionally, there aren't a whole lot of renewable resources that can provide that. The most common one would be geothermal resources, but there are a few other plants using bioenergy would also fit in that category, for instance. And then the other category, broad category, is long duration storage of 8 hours or more. Theoretically, you can stack 2 4-hour batteries and get your 8 hours. Then you're competing with all the other resources that are all the other that other 12,000 megawatts of resources, some of which will be batteries. So while they can be met that way, the reason we provided a little more of a glide path to compliance would be to allow load-serving entities to consider some other technologies like compressed air, underground compressed air, or pumped storage, or other forms of chemical storage that are not quite as developed as a lithium ion.
So as these new technologies develop, I mean, certainly we need baseload reliable energy. I think reliability is kind of the key word here that we kind of say over and over again. But I mean, on a pragmatic level, if a lot of these projects continue to need more time to develop, what is then the plan to ensure reliable, continuous energy?
Well, I guess I would say that things like the strategic reserve and the potential extension of Diablo provide some kind of cushion and bridge to fill in for that uncertainty and in case those projects don't come online in time. I think the authorization to the iBank to start a transmission, to provide funds for transmission loans could really help, because you wind up with a bit of a chicken and egg situation with those new resources. If they're in a resource that doesn't have transmission, then the transmission kind of typically waits for a generation contract, but it's hard to get a generation contract when basically the first project needs to carry the cost of the transmission and then recoup those costs over time. So that's another opportunity, is to look at picking the egg over the chicken, or whatever, if you will, and get the transmission built to resource-rich areas. Seems like it's another important opportunity. We've done it before, and certainly considering it now.
So on that note, then, I mean, you mentioned that some of these contracts are extended year after year after year. How is that assessed? I mean, do you decide like this year we're going to need another year extension? It's kind of hard as these assets are functioning, that you need some certainty over time. You just can't ramp up, as you indicated. You ramp up a power plant in the midst of a crisis.
So the new resources, they need long-term contracts. That's the only way they get built. Typically 10, 15, 20-year contracts. Maybe pumped storage. Those are massive projects. They probably conceivably need even longer-term contracts. The short-term kind of bridging, like the ones through cooling, right now, the way that has happened, and it's happened once so far, which was a 3-year extension from the original contemplated dates, which was really disappointing. We really had thought we had things planned to retire those plants in 2020, and it was not an easy decision to extend those once. And so those were 3-year extensions. And now what's being proposed is another 3-year extension, and again, whether they are needed the full 3 years or not, that would be kind of TBD.
Okay, so those analyses are still being done, and whether we need to extend out another whatever 3 years or not.
The energy agencies have recommended the 3-year extension at this point to the Water Board. The Water Board's now considering. And then I think within that recommendation, there was an acknowledgement that 3 years is a kind of to be on the safe side, but it could conceivably be that maybe perhaps the full 3 weren't needed.
So let me ask kind of a basic question. There's a lot of agencies here, and then of course EWR is not here, but I'm assuming they report to you. Who is the lead agency when it comes to developing kind of the the energy portfolio moving forward and kind of how we plan.
Well, I mean, I'll say we all have pieces of this, right? The transmission is overseen by the CAISO and approved by the CAISO transmission planning, and the PUC only has jurisdiction over 65% of California's load. So CPUC evaluates and directs the procurement on behalf of those entities under our jurisdiction to meet the reliability and GHG goals of the state.
Yeah, just want to add a couple things there. I think, thank you for that question. Remember, I think the 30,000 foot level, when we have planning and kind of procurement, like authorizing the procurement part of it, and then you have the building part of it, and then you have to think through the contingencies. So that's kind of how we have structured our work between the three agencies, along with other agencies like DWR and such. So, as Pete, Director Scala mentioned, we all have pieces of leadership, but we work on all the pieces together. So when we think about the planning phase, we have the 2045 planning. That's a statewide planning on SB 100. It's done jointly between CEC, CPUC, and CARB, and we have a real opportunity to set the trajectory of the next 25 years. And then comes the 10 to 15 year forecasting period. That's where CEC does the demand forecasting element, but we do it jointly through a process called the JASC, Joint Agency Steering Committee, and we agree on the forecast and the scenarios. And then that goes through to CPUC, who is then looking at the demand forecast and authorizing the necessary procurement, and back to CAISO for the transmission planning. So we have those pieces, and I think, if to your point, I think there needs to be a collective plan of articulation, and then we're beginning to bring it together over the last couple of years.
I guess that's the big challenge that I see, and this is a dynamic that it's through a lot of challenges. I mean, as we kind of discussed the supply chain issue, we had a lot of, GoBiz was involved, and you had the California Transportation Agency was involved, and it was kind of like everyone's kind of, and then you had the ports, and everyone's kind of pointing at each other. And in this dynamic, I just kind of want to avoid, I know you're all kind of collaborating, but I'm just trying to understand, like, who's the accountable entity in this whole situation, and is it
all three
CEC?
of us?
All three of you guys. Yeah. Okay. Going back to, and I think the chair mentioned this kind of the tension between affordability and reliability. It seems like when we talk about strategies and how we deal with these energy crises, and I think it's kind of an ongoing challenge right now, is that more of the burdens are being placed on the consumer. Costs certainly have increased, driven by a number of factors, and then we're now, as a state, all three of you are asking consumers to now curb their usage, and so there's a lot of responsibility that's put on the consumer. Is that a dynamic that you see like being alleviated at some point? I mean, I would think that we would probably look for, in terms of the strategy, a way to expand reliable supply so that there isn't kind of this continued stress on the consumer. Or is my analysis incorrect?
No, I think that's spot on. And I think the solution is, it's going to be a variety of tools in the toolbox to get us back to a point where we aren't relying on flex alerts and asking customers to participate in, conservation and pressuring them to do so. And they're going to involve tools like demand response programs and new demand response offerings, the strategic reserve for those needle peaks that we don't bake into and maybe don't want to bake into rates because they are resources that are kind of break the glass resources. We only use them on rare occasions. They don't bid into the energy markets, right? So they're going to be kind of different categories or different buckets of tools to help resolve this problem collectively. And we need to catch up, right? We need to recognize that that the current planning reserve margins that have been working for the past 20 or 30 years are not seeming to work anymore, and we're currently reevaluating at the PUC what the impacts, factoring in more recent climate, weather forecasts, outage rates of resources, hydro availability, imports, whether we can count on the amount of imports that we've had. All those are going into our next round of procurement authorization to determine just how big of a reserve margin we need to get back on track to that, get the baseline you're talking about back to where it needs to be.
So then, I guess when we talk about costs, I mean, that's certainly you've got a very difficult job because you're dealing with supply planning and costs. And you mentioned this affordability ratio. Has there been an analysis in terms of what the cost is to the average consumer over time, and what is going to be placed on them moving forward?
So ultimately the costs are reflected in the rates that everyone's paying, right? That's where you can see what's happening. We are seeing pretty rapid increases in rates for a variety of reasons, not just the generation procurement that we're talking about here, but wildfire and the price of gas, natural gas. So I think that's going to continue to be a challenge. As I kind of the closing point of my opening statement was that we look forward to working with the legislature on opportunities to look at how to modify. And it's been really helpful to have the support we've already had to help mitigate some of these cost increases. And I guess I think one sort of silver lining here is that this increased electrification of vehicles and buildings does provide an opportunity to spread these costs over a lot more kilowatt hours. So that can ultimately reduce rate pressure over time, especially if we get the use and the charging set right, so that we're not creating a lot more sort of need for peak resources as we transition to that high electrification end state.
Right, but when you're looking at all the tools in the toolbox, are the costs to the consumers, are they considered in these discussions? I mean, if you look at what you've just identified and what you've just said, more electrification is going to require more supply. And if we're not generating enough supply, that's a problem, right?
Yeah, I want to just add a couple of thoughts there for consideration. So one, you mentioned earlier about just the impact on the consumers. So I think one of the opportunities that we were given as joint agencies is to really explore the opportunity for the $1 billion reliability investment. And as a part of that, we were also asked to investigate the opportunity for demand flexibility. So I think that is a huge opportunity for us to figure out how to take these situations where we are sending an alert or calling for a flex alert and really institutionalize through automation. CEC currently has a proceeding on load management standards that allows for automation of some of these resources. And what we are beginning to see from early consumer behavior surveys is that generally the consumers are okay to, for example, discharge their behind-the-meter storage devices up to 20%. But beyond 20%, they are really concerned about their own reliability. Another opportunity is today we have 1 million electric vehicles on the road, which is approximately 10 gigs of storage on the wheels. So the opportunity here is figuring out how we can maximize the demand flexibility side that will tier them into different buckets. The first bucket becomes transformational grid planning versus those amounts of needle peak, and how do you compensate and incentivize. So just wanted to add that the electrification that the state is pursuing might also provide us opportunities and tools in better planning the grid moving forward.
Sure. But I think that goes back to the original question I've outlined, which is that outlining kind of what you've just indicated, right? Moving forward in the future, it seems to me that the strategy is putting more and more stress and responsibility on the customer. That now you've got an electricity grid that is leaning on customers to do more instead of actually, as a state, generating the power we need to keep the lights on. Do you acknowledge that tension?
Well, I guess I'd say that it speaks to trying to do it in the most cost-effective manner. So I think what we certainly want to get away from really leaning on customers to reduce their usage because things are hot out. That's not a good outcome. But providing carrots to customers who are interested, or third-party providers who can aggregate those customers to adjust their charging and still be able to override it if they need to, or pre-cool their home, or have some of these options for customers that would be happy to participate and help and receive some compensation for doing so. That's kind of that's the best of both worlds. That's better than being kind of sort of agnostic or indifferent to when or how the customers are charging, and just build everything we need on the supply side to accommodate kind of the worst case charging. So I think that's the goal, is to make those work together. But I agree with you, not just keep telling customers things are hot, you've got to turn your air conditioner up. Like, that's not a good outcome.
But here's a huge problem, right? You got reliability. So the average Californian, they're not sure about the reliability, and then, oh, by the way, the rates are going up, and then thirdly, which is the triple whammy, which is, oh, we're asking you to do more, right? That's not a sustainable situation. And and of course, my understanding of the dynamics that are happening right now is that you've got reliable, continuous production of electricity through natural gas and on older facilities. They're being forced to close, right? But then to make that up isn't really reliable either, because you've got intermittent sources of energy, and as you indicated before, they need long lead times, and we don't know when there's permitting issues and supply chain issues and everything else that may not produce or may not be sufficient in terms of making up that difference. And so we've built in a structure, a framework that is only going to make the reliability and affordability issues worse. Does that make? Am I incorrect?
I just want to add, I think you're kind of your 30,000-foot level of framing of as we move forward with shutting down our fossil generation, in order to meet our clean energy goals, and trying to contend with the climate crisis of these enormous peaks. How do you do it in a reliable fashion? And I think that's a very fair question, and I think the agencies are trying to do this in a way that we can meet affordability, our clean energy goals, as well as reliability. And what we see is the demand side provides a huge opportunity, and an opportunity to do it in a way that the customers do not feel impacted. As Director Scala was mentioning, how do you take into account the demand side resources in a way that, rather than calling them at the last minute when it's really hot, is that pre-cooling becomes a part of our general process, and how do we alert the demand side resources multiple days ahead, so there is a planning by the third party offering parties, or how do we use our storage that we have, which we hope will not affect the consumer comfort. So I think there's a planning element that we have to work on, and we take your points.
Sure. Let me just ask finally. The Cal ISO person is very quiet, which I never really want that to happen. So, is there anything you'd like to add to this conversation?
Absolutely. Actually, there's one thing I'm surprised both Vice Chair Gunda and maybe Director Scala were too modest to mention, but there's been significant activity on the load management side, and we're very excited about that. So at the California ISO, we produce prices on the grid every 5 minutes, and the intent of that is to show consumers when it's more economical to use electricity versus not. So during the peak, when we're going through sunset and we have a huge spike in demand, you'll see that our prices naturally rise. But down at the retail side, a lot of that is muted, either not visible at all or sort of in kind of broad time of use rates. But I think both the CEC and the CPUC are taking great strides in trying to deliver that messaging and that communication down to the retail level. But The pairing of that I do want to point out, I think to their credit, is that it does leverage a lot of the technology that we have today. So it does not require actual people to be staring at a rate or turning things off manually. But if it were integrated in our home energy systems, if Alexa knew what the rate was coming, it could modulate the temperature in your refrigerator or your pool pumps. That could be hundreds and thousands of megawatts off the grid without anyone even noticing it. And so those are, I think I just wanted to highlight some of the excellent efforts going on at the agencies to help with that. In terms of actually coordinating with us, we agree. There's been years of coordination and cooperation through the Joint Agency Steering Committee, for example, going back to 2013, where we have been working very closely with the CEC in developing that energy demand forecast, which, for example, this year has a new scenario looking at our transportation electrification needs, which are really ramping up, and also considering other forms of electrification. And that going 10 years out and understanding how do we actually prepare for that. Then we rely on the Public Utilities Commission to really optimize what that generation portfolio looks like, which also optimizes least cost, meeting our GHG goals, meeting our RPS goals, and reliability. That comes back together at the California ISO so that we can run through our transmission planning process, not only for the overall system, but also to identify areas on the grid where we might need reliability. But in doing so, we're able to put all of the puzzle pieces together so that when we're talking about costs, it's not just one side or the other, it's looking at the totality of it, which eventually will find its way into rates. So I really commend a lot of the efforts that my colleagues are working on and struggling through, because these are not easy conversations to get through. And as Director Scala mentioned, there's often these sort of like chicken and egg issues that we have to deep dive into and maybe more specifically address versus on a system-wide level. But the last thing I want to iterate is our system is a lot peakier. It does have those kind of needle peak demand points. And I think some concentration there and kind of spreading out the load, that's going to be a much more successful strategy, which does involve participation of the load side, but hopefully in a way that is not burdensome, doesn't inconvenience folks, and is leveraging the technology and assets that we have to make it seamless.
Sure. I want to appreciate the patience of the chair. I know there's another panel. So since I'll throw this one question out there and you can feel free to answer it, I would like to kind of get your sense on the transmission requirements and kind of where we are as what grade would you give our transmission capacity and where we need to go. But this is a really important conversation that we need to have, kind of a real heart-to-heart on assessment of what's happening. I do believe, and I would say that if we are really going to prioritize reliability and affordability, I think we're going to have to reevaluate some of the things that come out of this building. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's the goal of this hearing, right? To ask questions and to figure out where we're going next, and to allow members, right, to get their questions answered.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was the last question directed towards me. So yes, one of the things as this hearing has noted is the incredible coordination collaboration we had looking at the 20-year outlook. So our normal processes only go out 10 years, but we really understand, given what's being driven here through SB 100 and various other pieces of legislation, that we need to look even further beyond where we have traditionally been planning. So that was an extremely fruitful exercise. I think there was a lot gleaned from that exercise of what that could look like 20 years out. And so that helps us as we look at the 10-year, what does that bridge look like? What do we need to prepare ourselves for? And that's been an excellent discussion with CEC, PUC, also with the Air Resources Board, as we drive to our clean energy future and what the transmission upgrades might look like. But again, I want to note that analysis that the CAISO put out for the 20-year outlook is focused more on the transmission side, but the other piece is always going to be the generation side and where load goes, so load demand. So it's important to have all the puzzle pieces together, and I think a lot of that will kind of feed through the natural planning processes that the agencies and the CAISO already have. Thank you.
Thank you. So Mr. Ting?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to kind of jump off from where Mr. Fong started, was around strategic reserve. Can you tell us what has been purchased for this strategic reserve as of now?
Yeah, thank you, Member Ting. So the main pieces for this year has been support of the imports, about 1,000 megawatts of imports that were funded through the DWR process. There were about 120 megawatts of temporary gensets that were funded, and CEC
Of temporary what? I'm sorry.
temporary gensets, generation sets.
Oh, generation sets.
Yeah.
What kind of energy is that?
They were a fossil generation.
Can you be more specific?
Yeah, but they were diesel, I suppose. And then we had roughly 300 megawatts of support from CEC's DSGS program, the Demand Side Grid Support Program. And those incentives were primarily also made to backup generators that were running on diesel.
So the imports are just the day of purchases, right? It's not, because it's odd to have a. So are they contracts?
They were able to pursue multiple days ahead. They were able to buy import packages as the heat wave we were experiencing. So they were not real time. They were actually brought ahead of time.
Got it.
But some of them were actually, sorry to interrupt, but
No,
some
please.
of them were monthly products and multi-month products, and then some were in this sort of several-day time frame. Both were all of the above.
Got it. So I guess it's not really what I envisioned when we passed a strategic reserve. To me, that was either temporary, more along the lines of what you were talking about, Commissioner Gunda, which is really sort of temporary generation or backups. Is there a reason why we're so heavily reliant on imports? I imagine that the challenge with imports is that if the actual load serving entity needs those, we're not going to get that energy.
I think going forward, it's sort of a short-term versus long-term or medium-term. It takes a little more time to get some of these other resources stood up. There was a fair amount of care taken to make sure that the procurement that was being performed for those additional strategic reserve imports were not getting ahead of the load-serving entities that were procuring to meet their own RA resource adequacy requirements. We had a lot of I had a lot of conversations with the procurement folks in the IOUs and the CCAs to make sure that was that didn't happen, and that is something we have to be careful of. And that's similar issue with batteries, right? As I mentioned earlier, 14,800 megawatts ordered out. A decent chunk of that at this point is going to be lithium batteries, especially in the short term. We have to take care that we don't wind up through the strategic reserve creating more demand and competing for those same resources. As I mentioned, we have supply chain issues and there's just a scarcity in lithium ion. So we have to take great care, and we are taking great care not to pay attention. And we're in conversation with DWR to make sure that we minimize those types of unintended consequences.
But part of, I think what you mentioned is it's partly why we're looking at increasing lithium extraction here in this state. It's why we're also trying to, we know we're going to need more lithium until there's other technologies to do electric storage. So at this time, I think it's not just being careful. I don't want to say, oh, let's not go buy lithium because the price might go up, so let's go buy diesel. Because that price might go up too then.
Understood. It's in the year to two time frame that I'm talking. This year, next year, and
Understood.
We have between this year and next year, 2023, 2024, 8,000 megawatts and coming online to meet those IRP orders. And we're hearing from the load-serving entities who are on the hook to procure those that they are struggling that lithium-ion suppliers in that time frame are struggling to find the supply. They're also competing with the electric vehicle world. So I think
how much this year is going to be lithium-ion? Sorry to cut you off.
No, it's okay. Sorry.
It's just the time is getting shorter, so I apologize about.
Yeah, I have. I don't know, but I do have a colleague who may be able to answer that.
You have a guess? Are we talking?
I do. Oh, a guess.
Are we talking like 200? We're talking 2,000? We're talking
for this coming year's 2,000 megawatt, or actually it's 2,800 megawatts required this next by July, or rather by August 2023.
For lithium.
Well, no, that's the total, and of that, I would suspect that at least 70 to 80% of it. So probably 15 to 2,000 or maybe even more megawatts. I'm in the 2,000 megawatt range.
Apologies, you just mentioned 8,000. So is it 8,000 or 2,800?
Sorry, it's 2,800 for 2023.
Okay.
And then another 6,000 for 2024. So I combined the next two. I was talking about 1 year or 2
So when you
year
said
time
this
frame.
year, you meant this year plus next year.
Yeah, I think I was trying to speak to the near-term time frame, and so I initially started with 8,000, or actually it should have been 8,700 for the next 2 years. But to be specific, it's 2,800 this coming August, and then another 6,000 June 2024.
Great. And you said about approximately 70% lithium.
I'd say at least 70 to 80% of that in that time frame is likely to be lithium, or it's going to be storage or storage plus solar projects.
Yeah.
And there's some wind and there's some other resources as well.
Great. What was the cost of the 120 temporary diesel generators and the 300 backup diesel generators?
I do not have that information on me.
You got a rough guess?
Um,
I'm talking billions, millions,
so
thousands.
It would be millions. So in taking from 2021 installations, we were spending about $1 million each megawatt, a little bit over $1 million. So,
Roughly 120 million. I mean, give or take, right?
Approximately 150 million.
Okay. How much would storage have cost? How much does storage cost?
I'd want to get back to you on that. We've seen.
We don't have a rough cost for storage. We don't know.
So it's been a moving target of late, pretty dramatic moving target of late. So
what does it move between? 10 cents, 3,000.
Well, yeah. The other thing is, are we talking all-in costs? Are we talking about they're PPAs? So the load serving entities.
Let's be exciting. Let's talk all-in costs.
So
just go crazy.
I'm gonna need to call a friend to answer that. I just don't have it at hand. I don't want to throw a number out there that's not
this is
accurate.
like I feel like Regis
Isn't that
Philbin on the
game
pyramid.
show?
Yes,
Isn't that
exactly.
game show?
Yeah.
It's time for the lifeline. Okay, you can call the lifeline. We're going to come back to you.
Okay,
Why don't you get on the phone? We're still going to wait for our questions to be answered today.
thanks.
So you had mentioned in particular around and just a ballpark. I'm not looking for, this is just a rough estimate. You had mentioned in particular around interconnection, and I think that's a really interesting issue. I'd heard that there were issues around interconnection. So could you expand on that? Sort of what's some of the barriers around interconnection? Or anybody? I don't know, Mr. Scala, if you're the expert, or anybody. Maybe it's Ms. Ho.
Well, I'll say it's the challenges in one big issue is that the utilities are spending a lot of time on wildfire mitigation upgrades. They talk about that being their number 1, 2, 3 priorities, and we stress that we agree, and that they also need to work on priorities 4, 5, and 6, like interconnection upgrades, and they can be a bottleneck. Sometimes the equipment itself can be a bottleneck, those are the two primary issues.
I'll address this question to Mr. Friedman since he's in the audience as well, but also how much of that is the IOUs get reimbursed for wildfire mitigation, but they're not getting reimbursed for interconnection? Or they don't get to charge their cost of capital? Or do they? I don't know. I'm just asking.
They don't get the charge until it's used and useful, until it's online. Is that what you're asking?
I know. That's actually,
Yes.
it's just a question whether they do. So there's no misalignment of incentives, meaning
Right. No,
they're getting paid either way.
They get paid. No. They get paid when it comes online. I see. Yeah.
I believe we have someone from the CPUC that's on Zoom that can answer Mr. Ting's question.
I'll turn it over to Molly Sturkle, the program
very
manager.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Hi, good morning. Good afternoon, Assembly hearing. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Yes.
you great.
Okay, so I think you're interested in the cost of storage. Is that what you're asking me right now, or did we move on to a secondary
No, no,
question?
we are still on that topic. Thank you. On storage, correct.
Okay, on storage, yeah. So first, I'd just like to reiterate that my colleague Pete Scala was exactly correct. We do have on track and in contract, we do expect there to be close to 3,000 megawatts of new storage within the next 12-month period. We've started thinking about the reliability year as starting in October, so like October 2022 and lasting through the 12-month period that would end next September 2023. So when I quote that number of about 3,000 megawatts, and most of that is storage, I think it's over 2,800 is in contract of storage. There are an additional 1,500 or even more resources nameplate that would be a variety of different technologies that also will probably be developed in that same time period, but they just don't necessarily count towards the net qualifying capacity, which is sort of the center of today's hearing. So, more megawatts in nameplate are being developed than they are in terms of NQC.
Ms.
The vast
Strickle,
majority of the NQC comes from storage.
Did you have a cost estimate for me? That was the question.
Sure. Yeah. So the cost estimate is definitely a moving target. First of all, the costs of the storage resources can be as much as like $1 billion for 500 megawatts of resources. That can go up based on the inflation pressures we've had. And it can also go down based on the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well, let's
it can
not
go up depending on cost of land or other factors.
Okay, but Ms. Strickle, let's not look into the future. We'll leave the crystal ball aside. Why don't you tell us what you've recently entered into contracts over? Because you alluded to contracts you've been entering into.
Right. So unfortunately, being on the spot in a hearing like this, I am not at liberty to disclose the confidential terms of the utility contracts because those are allowed under our regulations to be held confidential to protect consumers from, we want our consumers to benefit from price competition, and we don't want to announce prices of one market actor to another market actor, which I'm sure you can understand. So we do allow prices to become public after 3 years. So I'd have to go back and see like what are our currently public prices. We also do our modeling and things based on public price projections from things like Lazard and Bloomberg, New Energy Finance, and we can provide those to you.
If I could stop you there. So this is, we're not, okay, I guess this is a request from the legislature to the PUC regarding a state appropriation. So I don't know how that could be. I mean, we're talking about the strategic reserve, are we not? We're not.
No,
I'm sorry.
We're talking about the PUC's orders to load-serving entities that we regulate and their procurement. I'm not aware of strategic reserve battery procurement at this time.
Sorry.
So we might be...
Thank you. So this is just what's coming online in the universe of energy supply.
For the CPUC jurisdictionals, yes.
Right, correct. And there are 40 different load-serving entities, and they're all entering into contracts. There are over 100 different contracts per year. So in some sense, the developers are competing with each other, and also the load-serving entities, which are comprised of energy service providers, investor-owned utilities, as well as community choice aggregators. They are all entering into different contracts.
Got it.
So in some of those contracts are public, like because of the regulations of that particular entity, and some of them are held in high confidentiality.
I totally understand. So yes, so you're just telling us what is happening in the marketplace, and
Correct.
Right.
And you'd asked about interconnection challenges.
Yes.
Molly stood up that TED task force I referenced earlier, so she may be able to elaborate on some of the challenges, where the pinch points are on interconnection.
Well, I think that, the remarks kind of made a reference just to the fact that in order to maintain the safety of the grid, the process is extremely deliberate and detailed and technically technically focused on safety and reliability, because we need the grid to be secure. So that takes time. And so each interconnecting project does go through a lengthy application, study, review process. If they get estimates for the cost of the interconnection, if the developer likes that, they sign an interconnection agreement. And then usually it takes about 2 years for 2 to 3 years for the project specific interconnection facilities to come online. There may also be network transmission facilities that facilitate one or more projects. And so a project may want to wait for the development pattern of the transmission grid to support that project. So I think, each and every project, has its own interconnection story. And, all sides would like the process to go faster. The interconnecting utility staff would like the projects to just come in the door and be ready to go and not wait for a contract. And the developer, as soon as they get a contract, they would like the interconnecting utility to build their facilities immediately. But in fact, everybody has to work together, and many of the pieces just have to fall into place. So it's complex construction timelines with lots of interdependencies. That's the name of the interconnection game.
Got it. Totally understand. Is there anything we could do to make it go faster?
I think constant vigilance and pressure, so that and I'm always open to ideas. I think we have really supported transparency, process improvements, and just constant measurement and management of the process. So I would like to perhaps pass this to my colleague Delphine, and maybe she could talk a little bit about the interconnection process enhancements that the CAISO has undertaken that have been very helpful and will continue to yield fruit ahead.
Thank you, Molly. So building on that, the CAISO, we need to recall that under our tariff, we do have an obligation to look at all of the interconnection projects and evaluate them. So right now we have over 100 gigawatts of interested parties trying to interconnect to various parts of the grid. That's obviously well beyond the capacity that the state needs, but we are obligated as the CAISO under our tariff to evaluate and study those. And so that has created quite a logjam in our processes as we're trying to weed through which projects are probably going to make it to the finish line. So as Molly mentioned, in our interconnection process enhancements stakeholder initiative, we've had several phases now where we're looking at various levels of improvement, both in terms of trying to get more commitment for folks that are in the interconnection queue so that we know which ones will actually get to maturity. But also we are working with the state agencies to try to understand of those projects, are there also clear policy motivations that the CAISO could also evaluate in considering our work on the interconnection side? So as Molly noted, it is a delicate balance. Not only does the CAISO need to work with the agencies, all the developers, as well as the investor-owned utilities who ultimately own the transmission system and operate those, but we also have to be respectful of the tariff that we are bound by. But those processes are ongoing. Those conversations are happening right now, and we're keen on working with our partners to keep improving.
But I guess, I mean, given that we are acting as if we're in a state of emergency, right? And I understand the process is complex. It's very delicate. This is not something that you can just tilt up overnight. But you just heard Mr. Scala saying, hey, we did the, we had to keep the OTCs open another 3 years, something we didn't want to do. We had to keep Diablo open, something that we were planning on closing. And so I guess when I hear it's complicated and it's just taking a while, I guess to me it doesn't strike me as an agency that has a high sense of urgency, like the same urgency that I think we are hearing from our constituents and from other Californians that feel like, what's the state doing to manage and increase the amount of supply to say we have all these projects ready to be interconnected and trying to get online, and they're more than we need, then what are we doing with the reserve? Why do we need to keep these OTC plants? Why don't we just get everyone why can't we just get everyone interconnected and online?
Not all of those resources that are in the queue sort of standing in line are actually going to make it to maturity. So there's going to be various situations either with their funding or the firmness of their development. But I think a lot of this comes back to understanding the underlying rationale. So I think with our energy transition, a lot of things have changed. We are reevaluating our processes to make them more effective as we're moving forward. But that also means that I think in changing our processes, we also need to go through the appropriate stakeholding and open processes that got us here in the first place. So part of the interconnection process enhancements is a series of stakeholder initiatives that the CAISO has conducted with our stakeholders to understand and hear from them how can we transition and transform our existing process, because we do ultimately need their support. We understand there's a problem, we've identified it, we're working together to try to change it, but I don't think the solution is necessarily obvious. So if we said to all 100 gigawatts of resources, great, you're interconnected, very few of them will actually get contracts and be supported. So we do want to be mindful that simply because there's a queue doesn't necessarily mean there's a commitment to it. And that's what we're trying to do, is create a process that will kind of filter out those that will rise to the top, and also get the resources in the right places and resources that will support state goals.
So what's the deadline for this new process?
Oh, we are already looking at it. We've already had first phases go in. So this is a continuous improvement of our interconnection process that we will be filing with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission.
When's the next filing?
I don't have that on hand, but I can check and get back to you on that.
I guess I'm still not here. I guess I'm getting a very bureaucratic answer that we're working on it. So I guess it doesn't make me feel very confident that change is imminent, I guess. Am I missing something?
I think the change that comes has to be the right change and not necessarily a fast change. We do have to work through our stakeholder process. We do need...
Can we do both?
We would like to work with our stakeholders on that, and the faster we can work with them on getting to resolution, the faster we would love to make those changes.
Okay, so I didn't get an answer. So you're working on it. You don't know when you'll be done. You don't know what improvements you'll make. You don't know how it's going to come or make it faster than 2 years. That's what I heard. But you're working on it. And you have no idea when you can get back to me with an answer.
Like I said, it depends on the open stakeholder process that we have, but it is a priority. It is
Everything
we are
do,
working on.
everything we do in life, especially in government, it depends. But your answer is absolutely not appropriate. It's not something that I think gives me great confidence. It shouldn't give Californians great confidence. So it's very concerning. You come to a hearing and knowing that we are pushing and doing everything possible to explore new ways to increase the supply of energy. We had to go backwards, in my opinion, just one person's opinion, backwards, and really move toward diesel, looking at natural gas, whereas we have potentially clean energy projects that we want to bring online. And what you're saying to me is we're working on it and we have no idea when we'll make the system better. And there's nothing that you're telling me that we could do as a state to make improvements.
Well, I want to correct that, and I'm not saying
Please.
that we're not effective at working on this, but it does take a lot of partners. So CAISO can do the analysis and the engineering study.
You give me no details.
Yeah, maybe I could help
Sure,
Delphine as your partner.
That'd be
You've been
wonderful.
so helpful to us. So one of the things that we did in recognition of this Assemblymember Ting is we did do this Tracking Energy Development Task Force. And what it did is it brought us together and we had some good conversations about exactly the frustration I think your line of questioning is getting at, like what can we do to accelerate it? And so working together, President Reynolds sent each of the investor-owned utilities a very clear and stern letter asking them to accelerate and remove all barriers to interconnection for near-term projects. She did that in March. Each of the utilities have responded to her, quite some time ago, of course, but that letter exchange fostered the commitment to ongoing biweekly conversations with each of the interconnection utility departments and the PUC, and we do bring in the CEC as well as the CAISO as appropriate as well as GoBiz, of course, depending on the particular issue for the particular project. So what we've started to do is manage what we've asked the utilities to measure, which is, how many projects are coming. And so, in the past 2 years, we've brought online over 150 different resources into the CAISO as new interconnections. Each of those projects went through all of the previously aforementioned interconnection processes approved by FERC. And in the next 2 years, there will be an equal number of new CAISO resources projects coming online. So the types of process changes that Delphine has been discussing are things that could be sort of midstream changes that might make it better for everybody, but we want to do those very deliberately because they could, we don't want to have the unintended consequences of disrupting anything that is currently in flight coming online for the next 12 to 36 months. So again, what we're trying to do is we have lists of all the projects that are coming online. CAISO has lists, the PUC has lists, and we work, and the utilities have lists, and we literally are working through the lists and making sure that none of them have barriers to interconnection, and that we get together all the right heads to remove each project. And when the situation does arise that there are problems that are cross-cutting across many projects, that's when we can look for process improvements. And again, I just want to emphasize that the president of the CPUC has at least implored each of the utilities to make it their top priority to do interconnection, but at the same time, recognizing, as what Pete was saying, that they also have other priorities, right? So that it's a really delicate balancing act. I'll just leave it there. Thank you for the opportunity to jump in on interconnection.
But I guess, so how do we, and I understand their priorities, which is also one of our priorities too. I mean, utility undergrounding is a priority for the state as well. So I don't think anybody's arguing, oh, this is not important. It's absolutely 100% important. It's obviously not as big an issue in my jurisdiction or my district, but it's a major issue in many other parts of the state. So I'm not arguing that. I guess the question is then, how do we also get them to, because it's not like the same division is doing both. They got divisions doing the undergrounding, some other divisions doing interconnection. What do we need to ensure that they are as focused on interconnection as they are on utility undergrounding?
Well, we'd have to have the utilities here to answer what division does what, but I do understand that interconnection, touches actually many departments in the utility, from distribution planning to transmission planning, and then of course, distribution and transmission construction. So they do have, complex project management teams that have to get engaged before them. And so it is actually sometimes the same people that are doing the work for like a new load interconnection, as well as a new generator interconnection, as well as the grid reliability and maintenance work. So a lot of times it is the same construction type crews and the same electrical planners.
And I think one other thing to point out, again, it was one of my three, the three challenges that we're experiencing. Interconnection was certainly one of them, and I don't want to minimize that, and I'm not minimizing that. But, and I think if you talk to different developers, some will tell you that there's a problem, and I think we'd look at it and we'd agree it's a problem and it needs to be fixed. And others would look at or had the experience where the TED task force actually stepped in, got something, others will be like, everything went fine, didn't need any help. Others will be, yes, we needed help. We contacted the TED task force, governor's office, they got involved, it got something moving. And there will also be developers who probably signed a contract or offered a contract to an LLC that had a really unrealistic start date, that the upgrades that would have been required are really 6 or 7 years out, and yet they signed a contract to come online in 2 or 3 years. So I'm sure you hear from those folks as well, right? So there has to, that is a part of what's going on in some of these cases. So, I just offer that. But absolutely, it's one of the issues that we have, I was on a call with the utility exec last week who was talking about prioritization, and that's, as I said, 1, 2, we get it. 1, 2, 3 should be wildfire, but there has to be 4, 5, 6. They have to be in here. But I also do want to reiterate in terms of that question of alignment, because it's a good one. There is an interest in the utilities getting that resource, getting that additional infrastructure into rate base, certainly. So they're not getting paid to provide that service until it's on the grid.
Got it. Just going back to the strategic reserve for a second, then also as part of our Diablo agreement, there's $1 billion that has yet to be appropriated, but the understanding is that there's $1 billion of energy, cleaner energy that we would like to bring on to increase supply. So what can we do to, should we put any of that money into supply chain issues, interconnection issues? What can we do to ensure that those funds will be spent toward cleaner energy rather than diesel generators or newer technology that will really kind of move us closer to our 2050 goals?
Yeah, thank you, Assembly Member. Just want to add to your previous questions too as I jump into this. So in terms of just the $1 billion that you've provided, as you specifically asked us to look at alternatives. So we just did a workshop 2 weeks ago, and the way we are structuring that is in broadly 3 buckets. One bucket is the process investments, potentially, just as you pointed out, through the summer in both the legislative briefings, but also in our public process, there have been a number of process issues that were raised, including local government support, as much as inflation support, and also, as you just talked about, what can we do in terms of interconnection. The broad problems we've heard around interconnection is staffing resources, and the staffing resources that are particularly have the skill set are supposedly very minimal on the market, and just the issue on that. And the second bucket is broadly on the supply side, on the bulk side, what can we do? Some of those resources that you've specifically identified are fuel cells and other long lead time resources that are not cost effective today for resource planning, but are on the cusp of commercialization. Is there something we can do to accelerate that? And the third bucket is broadly on the demand side. So including, what are the different demand side opportunities? One of the things that was noted was the V2G, vehicle to grid opportunity, and how do we expand that? So we're looking at those 3 buckets broadly. We also got some input on carving some of the money from that $1 billion for projects that can show immediately as a way to further. So we're looking at the totality of that in terms of not competing with the market, but invest in technologies that can really help us move forward. A couple of things on broadly the storage and the problems. I just wanted to make sure we hear you 100% that interconnection is one of the critical elements of our of making sure the grid is reliable. As both my colleague Delphine and Pete and Molly mentioned, I think those are cutting across a variety of entities that are responsible for that, all the way from LSCs to CAISO and other processes. And I think we just want to recognize to you that we see it as an important problem. Sorry, we haven't come with a very clear strategy on how to really overcome that barrier, but we are right now in the process of identifying the barriers and putting strategies to accelerate that process. And we have been hearing it loud and clear in stakeholder process. That's one of the issues we need to solve.
So does that mean that in the future, the hope is that for strategic reserve purchases, or even as we're bringing on supply online, that we are hoping to rely on much cleaner resources?
Yes, absolutely. So I think our hope is, you've made it very clear in the public meetings and the oversight hearings that you want the reserve to be as clean as possible, and we are hoping to rely on some of the fossil side early on because that's what we see is available today. But our hope is to really clean it up through the demand side and demand side programs.
And I think even like you mentioned fuel cells, so even the fuel cell technology may not be completely there yet. I think that is a worthy investment to invest in some of these newer technologies. Obviously, you have to make sure that energy is reliable and that when we need it, it's there. I think it makes sense to try to invest in some of these newer technologies to help get them to maturity.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think you raised this over the last several hearings too, the importance of making sure we are really looking at the demand side strategies. We are, as a part of developing the demand side flexibility goal, we are convening roundtables right now on what the barriers are. I think one of the things we collectively as the state entities here as partners have not been able to do is really develop that vision statement yet, and not for lack of trying, but it's been hard to get the pieces together, and we really hope to provide that to you in the quarterly updates that we are going to require in this process.
So I appreciate you mentioning process improvements. I would just urge all the agencies to really come back to figure out what we can do from a process improvement standpoint. I understand Ms. Sturkle's point about, well, some of these are just case by case, project by project. I understand that. But to not figure out what we need to do to streamline this and not to be able to articulate this at a time when we desperately need to get this energy online. And I understand we don't have control over the private marketplace, so whether something comes online or not, that's not entirely on us, because that's private capital company, individual companies. We understand we can only control so much, but at least the part that we can control in terms of our processes, our interface, I think really needs to be greatly improved. The fact that that can't even be articulated in a public hearing about what needs to be fixed or improved on, or what we're doing to improve it, is, I think, very, very troubling. Last question is really around permitting. I know the third point you mentioned, Mr. Scala, was around permitting. So what can be done to streamline the permitting on our side?
Well, so there are different types of permits. We've certainly gotten involved on some of the construction permit where we can write letters, encourage locals to do what they can to speed things along, and sharing the importance for summer reliability has been quite effective. And then there is this concern, fire marshal related, typically related concern about these new batteries, utility scale battery projects, and that's turning out to be it's just getting entities these familiarized with what what they represent, how they work, what the safety and fire safety pieces to that are. And
we had the same issue with solar. They had the same issue with solar.
Yep. And I'd say, we were, and the CEC has a lot of expertise in this area, got very involved, and have been, my understanding, quite helpful getting locals more comfortable with these projects over the past 4 or 5 months. And as I think there was even some information sharing across the different localities as some got more comfortable. So.
Yes, I'm not the lead on the permitting, but at a very high level, I just wanted to thank the legislature for the opt-in permitting authority that was provided to the CEC. I think it's extremely important for us to be able to work well with the local agencies on how best to move permitting, but I think you provided us some tools, and we'll continue to identify more for you to help us with. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ting. So we've heard legitimate concerns from both Chairman Ting and our Budget Vice Chair, Mr. Fong, but we can't forget about the costs that low-income communities like mine will bear from this, but not just the cost. There's many disadvantaged communities across the state that bear the brunt of impacts from the continued reliance on fossil fuel infrastructure, both in terms of air pollution, climate impacts like extreme heat. In my district, in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles, there were recently methane leaks from an aging natural gas plant. There's oftentimes emergency air quality waivers in Los Angeles County. And of course, the ones through cooling extensions that I know we've discussed. We're about 7 years from another potential Diablo Canyon extension. Very little time, and from what I've heard from what your answers to my colleagues' questions, we're not sure if we're going to even make that, right? I mean, what are we going to, if 7 years seems like very short from what I've heard, the challenges that you've identified. And so what can we do now to avoid the continued OTC and other aging power plant extensions?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think just wanted to kind of frame it at a little bit of a higher level just on the reliability crisis so that we could answer this question and set it up. So first of all, I want to acknowledge the equity implications of the reliability concerns, especially given that this year we were running diesel gensets and diesel backup generators in areas which are broadly located in communities of concern and frontline communities. And I think that's a very sobering reality of where we are today. And we want to recognize that we need to do more and better to make sure that we are on course of retiring the fossil generation and not burdening the communities. For that to happen, just at a very high level, we have three things we need to do. We need to have a robust strategy to make sure that we are building to the level that we need to be building on a regular basis. And the committees have pushed us, and CPUC has done a tremendous job on authorizing the procurement. And the questions right now have been, how do you build to that, right? So we're taking the steps to do that. I think that's an important component. There's another component, which is how do we continue to tackle this volatility of climate crisis with resources that are cleaner? Right now, given the short time period of how to build that strategic reserve, we are depending on a lot of the existing fossil generation. But current planning, we have done scenarios to see how we can reduce the reliance on the fossil generation. But you're absolutely right that we need a long-term strategy for making sure we can get through the needle peaks with clean resources.
Well, right now it feels that these extensions have become part of the strategy, and it's just the plan. We'll just extend it every, 3 more years, 5 more years, 7 more years. And I'm asking what do we need to do now so that these extensions and what we've promised these frontline communities, actually doesn't happen, that we don't continue extending?
I think it starts with planning adequately, Chair. I think one of the things that when we came into 2020, we were absolutely caught off guard with the amount of climate crisis that we have seen. That's just the reality of what happened. And I think as state agencies, we need to acknowledge that, while we were doing our best to plan, that was not seen well in retrospect. I think given the experience of 2020, 2021, and now 2022, we have historical evidence and visibility of how better to plan. I think that's the first step on how do we... Has
that planning, like what you said, the adequate planning, has that started?
Yes.
Or who will initiate that?
Yes, I think absolutely. The three agencies collectively have completely transformed, or in the process of continuing to transform, our analytical framework on how do we think about reliability under a climate threat. So I think that's the first step. And so now, as we've provided you over the summer mini analysis, now we are beginning to really plan for not forecasts, but scenarios. So historically, we've always said, what is the forecast based on the historical data? But now we are looking at many climate scenarios and understanding what the volatility could look like. So I think we are in a very good place, and we'll continue to refine that analysis.
And when do you expect a plan to become public?
So the first report we have that is coming to you in December will outline some of the work that we've already done and some that needs to be continued to be fleshed out. And over the next quarterly reports, we would imagine middle of next year, you will have a much more clear picture from all of us, both on the framework for the analysis and how we are mitigating them. Not to say that we don't have plans right now, but I think over the next 6 months, they'll come to much more clarity in a way we can communicate to you better.
I guess I feel that every hearing we say, we weren't expecting this, we're now going to plan for the future. We've been saying this for years. I mean, I've only been in the legislature 4.5 years, but I feel like I hear that's like a recurring answer that I get in hearings. And, we have a sense of urgency, right? I mean, these are frontline communities that are being, I feel, just neglected. And that's always our backup. Let's just continue running these plants that are polluting the air there, that are, causing public health issues in our communities. And, I want a plan that avoids that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do not want to speak about it in two ways. You're absolutely right. Starting in 2020, when we started estimating our worst case scenario, based on that 2020 experience going into 2021, we thought we had figured it out. In 2021, we experienced different effects, and then 2022 was completely different. But what it did do, though, is that we have now 3 years of historical data, which really helps construct our models. Coming into 2020, we just did not have that kind of data. And also, we had to socialize that this is not a one-time event. This could continue to happen. Early on, for example, in May, when we put out that we could have a 7,000 megawatt potential shortfall this year, the initial comments we received were that is just out of ordinary and that might not show up, but that showed up. So I think what you're beginning to see from the state agencies is we have a better framework on how to analyze that. But to your point, do we have a very clear solution on making sure that we can tell you today with 100% certainty that we are going to retire those? No, and we'll come back to you with that better plan sooner than later.
Okay, well, I look forward to that plan, and I will be looking out for it. It's very important to me, and I know to many other of my colleagues in the legislature that
Absolutely.
represent these frontline communities. We're, as representatives of these communities, we hear from our constituents about the impacts, the environmental impacts that these aging power plants have in our community, and local governments aren't able to move forward in terms of, land use planning when these plants are gone. And we're waiting for that. We really want that to move forward, and to have clean air and better public health outcomes.
Yeah, Assemblymember, just in closing, we, as a part of our integrated energy policy report this year, we did regional workshops, and we have been in Ventura County, Imperial County, and really kind of experienced boots on the ground the impacts of, for example, extending the OTC power plants. Equity is at the heart of the work we do. We absolutely recognize that, and we are sorry we haven't been able to accelerate the solutions to do that, and we will absolutely come back to you with solutions.
Is there something that, a request to the legislature that would help you accelerate that? What can we do to help that, to partner with you?
I think this year you've given us a number of tools in terms of both creating a reserve by removing a number of these plants out of the market and making it, use only under extreme situations. So that is, I think, a very right step. And now you've given us funding to accelerate the strategic reserve to be more cleaner, as well as broader clean energy resources. I think we have been given a number of tools this year. We have to, through the public process, figure out the best way to accelerate this to really bring as equitable solution as possible, as quickly as possible. So we'll absolutely come back to you with recommendations that we might have. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all the representatives from the state agencies that joined us today. There's still a lot of unanswered questions and follow-ups that we will be looking out for, but I just want to thank you for participating in our hearing today. We're ready to move on to the next panel, which is a panel of interested parties, also discussing the energy transition in 2030.
Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Mr. Breckel, right? Are you from the Clean Air Task Force? Will start this second panel.
Great, thank you. And this is on?
Yes.
Great. So good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to testify here today. My name is Alex Breckel. I'm the Director of Clean Energy Infrastructure Deployment at Clean Air Task Force. We're a global NGO working to reduce air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions quickly, affordably, and equitably. So as we recently heard, California has built an impressive amount of clean energy, relying on a bottoms-up, project-by-project approach to deployment. But as grid reliability challenges of the past 3 summers have revealed, this approach is failing to elicit the pace, scale, and diversity of new resources that the state needs to reach its ambitious clean energy goals. A better alternative, we believe, is for California to urgently develop a comprehensive clean energy deployment plan to chart its path to a low-carbon future, and I'll elaborate on that in just a moment. So I think a startling fact for me is that despite all of the new additions of clean energy and batteries we've just talked about, over the past decade, net generation capacity additions have remained flat in the state. So for every megawatt we're bringing online, we lose a megawatt due to retirements. Over the next 2.5 decades, CARB anticipates that the total generation capacity will need to be 4 times larger than it is today. So past decade, no growth. Next 2.5 decades, 4x growth in the total generation capacity in the California grid. And CARB also estimates that utility scale solar, despite all the challenges that we just talked about, would have to increase the pace of new additions by 5x compared to recent past. And that's for each of the next 20 years, so a sustained, extremely high deployment rate. And to integrate this much clean energy, the capacity of the transmission system, the large-scale transmission lines that move electricity to consumers would have to increase tremendously as well. One estimate puts it at roughly triple the capacity by mid-century to fully decarbonize the California grid. And yet, just when California's need for rapid clean energy construction and deployment is greatest, clean energy projects are taking far too long to complete. One example is the Topaz Solar Farm, California's and the United States' largest solar farms. It took 6 years to construct and begin operation. California would need the equivalent of 100 such projects just to reach its 90% zero carbon electricity sales target by 2035. That's just 12 years away. So 100 of the projects that took 6 years need to be built in just 12 years. And transmission capacity or transmission projects take even longer, as we've just been discussing, due to their size, their complexity, and I think difficult regulatory environment in California. And those have, in recent past, led to numerous delays in transmission projects that are underway. So currently projects that are under construction have accrued an average of 5 years of delay relative to what the California ISO anticipated those projects to take. Additionally, the 15 projects that are underway that are anticipated to be completed by 2030, that near-term goal that we've talked about, have taken 3 times longer than they've anticipated on average. And as more clean energy projects are built simultaneously in the coming years, the barriers to deployment that have led to these near-term delays, these past recent delays, including competition for land, local opposition, higher burdens on state and local permitting agencies, will only grow. They won't mitigate. So in October, the Clean Air Task Force Environmental Defense Fund published a report where we identified some of these challenges and offered a path forward. We found that achieving the state's clean energy targets will be challenging, but achievable if the state takes urgent action today. And to that end, we offered several specific recommendations here. I'll just talk about 3 of them. First, and most importantly, California should develop a statewide clean energy deployment plan that considers the state as an interconnected, diverse, and contiguous whole that it is. In developing the plan, the state should engage with local governments and communities and identify specific amounts, locations, and timing of new resource deployment and infrastructure expansion required across the state to reach its clean energy goals, near-term and long-term. Such a plan would help deploy clean energy more deliberately, affordably, and on time. Second, the state should assign primary responsibility for achieving the clean energy goals of the state and of the plan to a single lead agency and give them the authority to implement the plan I just referenced. Responsibility for achieving California's climate goals is currently spread among more than a dozen agencies with diffuse responsibilities and overlapping jurisdiction. As the old adage goes, when everyone's in charge, no one is in charge. Assigning a lead agency to implement the clean energy deployment plan will enable coordinated decision-making required to tackle a project of this enormity and this complexity. Third and lastly, the state should develop a dashboard to publicly track progress towards milestones established in a plan. There are numerous sources of information on how much clean energy, power lines, charging stations, and other clean energy infrastructure are built annually, but it's my contention that nobody inside the government or out can say definitively whether the state is on track to reach its clean energy goals affordably and reliably and on time. A dashboard would provide that critical information, also enhance accountability of the state agencies, and provide market certainty to clean energy resources. So in summary, California must build an unprecedented amount of clean energy and supporting infrastructure. Done right, this clean energy transition will do more than reduce planet-warming greenhouse gases. It will reduce toxic air pollution in homes and communities, provide hundreds of thousands of jobs, and place California at the forefront of the battle against climate change. And frankly, there isn't a moment to waste. Failing to rapidly deploy clean energy and related infrastructure today compounds the difficulty of doing so tomorrow. So now is the time for California to create and implement a clean energy deployment plan. Thank you for your attention. I welcome questions. I will also apologize. I will have to run just after 2 to catch a plane, but I can join by Zoom for the remainder of the question period. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we have Alexis Sutterman from the California Environmental Justice Alliance.
Hello, there we go. Okay. Hello, my name is Alexis Sutterman, and I'm the Energy Equity Program Manager at the California Environmental Justice Alliance, or CEJA. Thank you so much to the committee for allowing us to speak. CEJA is a statewide community-led alliance that works to advance environmental justice and alleviate poverty and pollution. We unite the powerful local organizing of our members in the communities most impacted by environmental hazards to pursue comprehensive policy solutions. Today, I'll start by talking a little bit about why we think California is in this reliability crisis in the first place and how this has harmed environmental justice communities first and worst. Then I will speak briefly about the dangers of the state's current strategy before outlining cleaner, healthier, and safer alternatives. So starting with how California got into this position, which we've already been in quite a large discussion around, we all know the science is clear. You know, the extraction and burning of fossil fuels are the primary driver of climate change, which we know are fueling extreme heat, droughts, and wildfires. These disasters hurt working class communities of color first and worst, and now they're putting so much strain on our outdated power grid that all of us are here to talk about reliability, and we've been doing it, for years. Of course, none of this is news. Scientists, advocates, indigenous leaders, and community members have sounded the alarms for decades about the need to move away from a fossil fuel-based economy, not only to protect our planet, but also to protect our community members. Despite warnings to move faster and farther on clean energy, however, we've seen that California has largely stalled in many ways, as folks have been noting. One reason is because some of these transition questions are extremely challenging and complex, which is why it's so great we're having this conversation today to get really into the weeds of some of these larger systemic interconnection issues and technical barriers. Other foundational reasons, however, also include a legacy of systemic racism, negligence, poor planning, and greenwashing and lobbying by the fossil fuel industry. But we're running out of time, and we can't afford to choose paths that do anything but cut our ties with the root driver of climate change. So next I'll talk about the dangers of the current strategy being taken by California, which includes an over-reliance on polluting and harmful resources like gas, diesel, nuclear, biogas, hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage. This past year, the California legislature, passed the Energy Trailer Bill AB 205, which among many things did create the Strategic Reliability Reserve. That we have already talked about. CEJA found this reserve to be extremely dangerous in many ways, as it was set up in a way that would likely fund diesel backup generators and the extended use of gas plants. As we all know, diesel and gas are extremely toxic. More than 40 constituents of diesel exhaust are listed as hazardous air pollutants by the US EPA. Gas plants also produce harmful pollution and risk releasing toxic methane emissions, and over half of gas plants are located in California's most disadvantaged communities. CEJA did appreciate Governor Newsom's signing statement to AB 205, which does direct the CEC, CARB, and DWR to ensure full engagement with relevant agencies and ensure that clean energy resources are prioritized over fossil fuels. It's worth repeating that clean energy resources should be prioritized over fossil fuels in all cases, as they are the root cause of climate change. And yet we are hearing today from various agency staff that there have already been processes in place to allow for more diesel and gas. So we would like to see more transparency in that, and definitely echo others' comments around ensuring there is a clear database to see, and also clear tracking to see what brought us to get to the decision of implementing more fossil fuels. Frontline communities see, feel, and breathe the impacts of this vicious cycle every day, and for the past 3 summers, they've experienced increased smog, pollution, and diesel exhaust in their neighborhoods as the governor's office has issued emergency proclamations unwinding critical air quality protections that EJ advocates have fought for and won. Not only are fossil fuels worsening the climate crisis and our public health, but they're also extremely unreliable. Back in 2015, the failure of the Aliso Canyon gas storage field threatened the reliability of the Southern California grid and sickened tens of thousands of local residents. In August 2020, rolling blackouts in California were compounded by failures at 2 different gas plants. In addition to gas and diesel, nuclear power also poses huge risks. CEJA was opposed to SB 846, which is looking to extend Diablo Canyon, as the location of this facility runs the risk of releasing deadly radiation to tens of thousands of residents near the facility, such as the EJ community in the neighboring Santa Maria Valley. California should also not rely on other harmful energy sources that continue to pollute communities, such as biogas, hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage. While these have been largely touted as clean energy solutions by many stakeholders, they all continue to pollute the air, land, and water in EJ communities while sending a lifeline to the fossil fuel industry. Biogas production releases carcinogens like benzene, which are toxic to human health, in addition to nitrous oxide and ammonia, which are tied to lung damage, cardiovascular impacts, low birth weight, and premature death. When burned, biogas also generates carbon dioxide and runs the risk of leaking methane. Rural communities in the Central Valley are largely affected by the increased pollution from biogas production. Furthermore, while green hydrogen has been a buzzword as of late, 99% of hydrogen used today is made from fossil fuels, and the only way for green hydrogen to be truly clean is for it to be produced using electrolysis powered by clean and renewable energy sources. Even then, it should not be used in applications where direct clean electrification is possible. And carbon capture and storage technologies are heavily being considered lately, but they have not been proven to work. In fact, CCS projects have repeatedly failed and continued to contribute to air, water, and land pollution by various studies. Our community's health is not a price we're willing to pay to keep the fossil fuel industry afloat. The good news is we don't need to accept the false trade-off between a reliable grid and cleaner air to breathe. In fact, there are many solutions that are clean and healthy while also bringing new economic benefits and opportunities to frontline communities. I'll speak to 3 of these solutions now and call out specific actions California can take. The first solution, as many folks have already been speaking to at length, is that we can be more strategic about how and when we use our energy while being more energy efficient by utilizing technologies, tools, and resources that help us do this. Folks earlier talked about the statewide flex alert that allowed demand to drop more than 2,000 megawatts. This is proof that consumers can support grid reliability, but to committee members' point earlier, they shouldn't be asked to do this in just a voluntary way, and we really need a more systematic approach to take advantage of this. This is why California should invest in demand-side resources such as energy efficiency, demand response, and smart thermostats, and ensure EJ communities are first in line to access them. Programs like the CEC's new novel Equitable Building Decarbonization Program that EJ advocates also helped secure funds for this year are a key vehicle for equipping low-income tenants with a holistic set of building upgrades. Additionally, California should ensure the success of its emergency load reduction program, which pays low-income customers to conserve their energy during times of surging energy demand. The PUC approved this program last December and required coordination and marketing, yet the CAISO Flex Alerts this year failed to even mention the opportunity to get paid for reducing energy consumption. These types of programs have proven successful in other states, but without sufficient outreach and communication, ours will likely fail. Second, we can increase local clean and distributed energy and storage. The way the electricity grid was originally set up is outdated and inefficient, and in order to ensure the electric grid is modernized to be reliable and responsive, California should invest in things like clean energy microgrids for EJ communities, which are capable of maintaining power while islanded or disconnected from the broader grid. This can enable low-income and medically baseline communities to have access to clean and reliable backup power even when the grid goes out. In addition, California should invest in community solar and storage, which can deliver clean energy when there is a greater risk of blackouts, while also bringing EJ communities bill savings and opportunities for energy democracy. With a quicker implementation of the AB 2316 Community Solar and Storage Program at the PUC, projects could likely be deployed by 2024 and 2025 and offset the need to keep once-through cooling gas plants online. California should also invest more in vehicle-to-grid integration and thermal storage, which will become easier to do with the influx of federal funds coming in. And lastly, we can increase utility-scale clean energy and storage procurement as soon as possible. A lot of folks today have mentioned a lack of a sense of urgency from folks that are charged with many responsibilities when it comes to energy procurement. This is one of the more obvious solutions, yet there have been so many barriers to it that have been discussed. In the Integrated Resource Plan proceeding, the Commission is requesting input right now to inform a new reliable and clean power procurement program. CEJA agrees that this kind of program is needed, and we urge that it be set up in a way that ensures load-serving entities procure enough to meet the state's air quality, climate, and equity goals. Additionally, the Commission should study resources and transmission needs in local areas and ensure load-serving entities do more targeted local clean energy procurement to enable the retirement of fossil fuel plants near EJ communities. There has been a big disconnect between local procurement and system-wide procurement. So in comments submitted earlier this month, several parties recognized the need for the Commission to prioritize ending reliance on gas resources in local areas through studying what kind of resources and transmission is really needed. And finally, California should increase interagency coordination, nothing new that we haven't talked about already, but also plan ahead so that we maximize benefits and reduce harms for EJ communities. In regards to energy procurement, planning ahead is especially important for larger projects, but in general, more coordination and earlier planning should be applied to all energy transition matters so that we're not wasting more time and more money into aging, polluting infrastructure that will have to retire anyway. To close, California cannot rely on approaches that continue a legacy of environmental racism. Instead of turning to gas, diesel, nuclear, hydrogen, biogas, and CCS, we can and must invest in and scale up clean and distributed energy, energy efficiency, and demand response that increase the reliability of the grid and strengthen the resilience of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Matt Friedman from the Utility Reform Network.
Thank you. It's great to be here today. My name is Matt Friedman. I'm a staff attorney with the Utility Reform Network, or TURN. TURN is an independent nonprofit ratepayer advocacy group here in California representing the interests of residential customers of the investor-owned utilities and all of the utilities that and load-serving entities subject to the regulatory oversight of the California Public Utilities Commission. California has committed to an ambitious set of goals for its energy transition over the coming decades. We've heard a lot about this today from the other witnesses. And these goals include decarbonization targets for the electric sector that will result in over 80% of the electricity coming from zero carbon resources by 2030, 90% by 2035, 95% by 2040, and hopefully 100% by 2045. And although these targets are important drivers of real-world actions, the legislature needs to recognize that successfully executing this transition is going to require a whole series of near-term actions to navigate a variety of challenges that lay ahead. So I want to offer a few thoughts about what comes next and to highlight some immediate concerns that should be addressed in the coming year. These concerns include skyrocketing retail electricity rates, delays in clean generation projects coming online, that's been discussed quite a lot, and the increasing difficulty of applying resource planning obligations to a wide range of independent load-serving entities. But first, I want to talk about the emerging crisis of affordability and the need for state support to lower electricity rates as a core element of the clean energy transition. This is a familiar story. You know that rates have been going up. For San Diego Gas and Electric and PG&E, residential rates are up almost 50% in the last 5 years. That's 50%, and 30% in just the last 2 years. The Public Utilities Commission, when asked to offer a formal projection, they think that rates are going to increase for these utilities by 8 to 9% per year for the next few years. But we think that's probably an under projection, given the other spending that's on the table. And meanwhile, PG&E low-income customer rates have risen over 60% since 2017 and over 40% in just the last 2 years. San Diego Gas and Electric, their residential rates today, their average rate's 37.5 cents a kilowatt hour. That means these customers are paying among the highest retail rates in the nation. There are many factors driving rate increases in California. It includes out-of-control utility spending, investments in grid hardening and wildfire mitigation, liability costs for wildfires, the adoption of rooftop solar, excessive utility shareholder profits, and generally the unwillingness of state regulators to impose spending discipline or hold the utilities accountable. But the results of these rate increases are clear. Customers are struggling to pay their bills, and they're increasingly facing disconnection from basic utility services. As of August of this year, customers of the investor-owned utilities owed $2 billion in arrearages. And although the state did appropriate $1.2 billion this year to cover the costs, this funding is split between private and public utilities, and it only covers debt accumulated between March 2020 and December of 2021, and a large portion of the current customer debt actually falls outside of this time frame. And meanwhile, between July and October of this year, 500,000 households served by the major investor-owned utilities received shutoff notices. That's 1.5 million California residents who have been threatened with termination of electricity and gas service because their monthly bills have simply skyrocketed. And winter is coming, and this means we're expecting an avalanche of shutoffs come later in the winter. The additional consequence of spiraling electricity rates is the impact on building and transportation electrification goals. Extremely high rates undermine efforts to persuade customers to switch from gas-fired furnaces to electric heat pumps and from gasoline-powered vehicles to electric vehicles. So what are the solutions? That's a lot of bad news. Well, part of the solution involves finding other sources of money to pay for a lot of these policy, program, and reliability objectives. This year, for many years, TURN has been urging the legislature to support our clean energy transition with taxpayer funds to reduce the burden on ratepayers. And this is critical because putting the entire cost of this transition on ratepayers is simply unsustainable. It's economically regressive. And again, it would frustrate our ability to promote other state policies like transportation and building electrification. Collecting funding for these programs via income taxes is fundamentally more economically progressive than using electricity rates, and recognizing that, the legislature this year passed a historic 5-year, $7.9 billion package to support energy reliability, debt relief, and clean energy investments. And then as part of the SB 846 package involving Diablo Canyon, there was a commitment to make an additional $1 billion investment to support a clean energy reliability investment plan. This level of funding is unprecedented, and it has the potential to accelerate this transition, help shore up grid reliability, and reduce the burdens on electricity customers. This assumes, of course, that the funds are spent wisely, and that the funds are spent to help transition us away from fossil fuels. And certainly we share the concerns that Assemblymember Ting has raised about the DWR Strategic Reliability Reserve and whether this money is being spent not to promote the transition, but instead to buy a bunch of diesel generators and to support continued operation of gas plants. Is that the wisest use of the money? Well, for the rest of the money, as many of you know, about a third of it is supposed to occur in future budget years. And these investments are critical to the success of many of our 2030 goals. So as we head into 2023, which we understand to be a much more lean budget year coming up, it's really important that the funding commitments made this year are honored. If commitments are not honored, and if authorized funds or funds that have been promised in legislation aren't appropriated, it's going to significantly hamper our progress in achieving a variety of these objectives. What can we do beyond what happened this year? Well, the legislature should follow these accomplishments by creating durable mechanisms for funding the state's commitments in this area. In 2022, there was a consideration of a climate and equity trust fund in Senate Bill 1020, authored by Senator Laird, that would have been able to channel various sources of money to reduce electricity rates. It's designed to be a long-term structure to help ratepayers out. And although the trust wasn't included in the final version of the bill that went to the governor, we think that this issue and this concept deserves continued conversation. Other sources of money include federal funds. In the last 2 years, the federal government has appropriated unprecedented amounts of money to support clean energy. The 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act has $7 billion, for example, to support distributed renewable energy installations in low-income and disadvantaged communities. We'd like to get a share of that money. We'd like to get a share of all the money that's been appropriated. And so California, as a near-term action item, needs to be aggressive in securing its share of federal funds that can reduce the burden both on the state's taxpayers and its ratepayers. And unless the state acts quickly, we may lose the opportunity to get some of this money. There are a lot of deadlines coming up. The state needs to have functioning programs, and the tight timelines are something that everyone needs to keep their eyes on. Separately from these funding efforts, we agree with the comments that have been made earlier about the barriers to deployment of clean energy infrastructure. Mr. Beckel had some very interesting observations about the delays in the time for new transmission projects to come online and how that's creating a cascading effect for generation. We're also seeing cost increases for generation. And Mr. Scala from the PUC sort of mentioned some of the supply chain issues that are going on there. And development delays, as we see it, for new clean resources are increasingly tied to the slow pace of transmission interconnection. And this is the result of both a suboptimal process, kind of slow walking by the IOUs, and fundamental constraints on transmission capacity. FERC is taking a look at this, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They've come up with a set of proposals for reforming the interconnection process. It's not clear how that will interface with what the California ISO has already done and is doing. Hopefully, continued improvements there will deal with some of those blockages that are creating these endless do loops. But one of the problems is just not enough transmission. For example, there's still no viable path for geothermal in the Salton Sea to deliver their output to the rest of California. The PUC recently directed all of the entities under its jurisdiction to go out and buy 1,000 megawatts at least of clean, firm, renewable capacity, which is a gateway for buying Salton Sea geothermal. So far, no Salton Sea geothermal has been bought under this program. We haven't seen the full results. Folks are out there buying, but so far the word is that the developers aren't able to get adequate transmission and guarantees that it will be built on time. And so we're sort of stuck in this same place. Meanwhile, the California ISO talked about their 20-year outlook today, forecasting the need for $30 billion in transmission investments. It's not clear who's going to build this transmission, how to align the timing of the transmission with new generation. Last year, Senator Becker authored SB 1032, which would have established a clean energy infrastructure authority to finance, develop, and own clean energy infrastructure, including transmission facilities. And we think that this kind of an approach is worthy of additional consideration. One of the key reasons is that transmission is expensive. It's not just expensive to build, it's expensive to own, especially when a utility owns it. Why? Because they're getting a return on their invested shareholder equity and their debt. And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has been quite generous in offering very lucrative returns. Well, what's the alternative? The alternative is using public sector debt, state financing. It's just math. You bring down the cost this way. Now, the utilities don't like this approach because it does threaten their profits, but looking at it from the consumer perspective, I think the state needs to take a very creative and ambitious approach to thinking about how public sector debt can be used to finance many of these new big infrastructure additions to make it cheaper for all of the customers. And then in addition to the transmission side, we haven't talked about the distribution side, which is fully state jurisdictional. But there are concerns that new interconnections at the distribution system level are being hung up. There's been recent coverage of concerns by folks in Fresno about their inability to connect new customers to the PG&E system, and their inability of customers to electrify and to get those connections. I think the legislature may want to focus on distribution interconnection issues in the coming year, since these processes are totally within the control of state agencies, and there may be the need for new reporting requirements and metrics and prioritization. But the distribution system is where there's a lot of action right now for development of small-scale projects, and certainly a lot of the other stuff that's on the agenda. So a suite of initiatives to address transmission and distribution capacity, financing and interconnection issues should be up for consideration. Finally, I just want to note the challenge of aligning the state's planning goals with the procurement processes of all of the load-serving entities. So we see a lot of studies. State agencies are publishing reports identifying the optimal resource mix for achieving our long-term decarbonization and clean energy goals. A lot of modeling work has been done, but is this what the future is actually going to look like? Is it going to be efficient and optimized on a statewide basis, just like you do in a model? Or is it going to be uncoordinated, inefficient, and needlessly costly? So how should the state ensure that the procurement done by dozens of load-serving entities makes sense and that it's working collectively to achieve our shared goals? The primary oversight of procurement really just occurs at the PUC, and it only applies to the private utilities and the community choice aggregators, electric service providers. It's through the Renewable Portfolio Standard Program, Integrated Resource Planning, and the Resource Adequacy Program. But the primary tool for new resource development, it's the Integrated Resource Planning Program, and the PUC is doing a blue sky refresh on that right now, trying to think about how would they redesign the program to make it work better. One of the issues is how do you deal with long lead time resources that are kind of lumpy? You can only build them in fixed quantities, and if it requires new transmission. It's not clear that anybody has figured this out, and specifically the PUC. For example, if the state's going to move forward with offshore wind, which has been a topic of a lot of conversation here, coordinated procurement may be essential. How's that going to occur? Does it make sense to assign fractional shares of a single project to many, many buyers? Or would it be preferable to assign the entire obligation to a central buyer that can negotiate a master contract? The PUC may or may not have the statutory tools it needs to ensure that the load-serving entities comply with its procurement requirements. And we think that the option of assigning some of these long lead time resources to a central buyer should be on the table. And finally, there's the publicly owned utilities that are overseen by the Energy Commission, but they are not directly regulated except for the Renewable Portfolio Standard Program. And while some POUs are heading in the right direction and they're doing great work as leaders, others are falling behind. In summary, we got major affordability challenges. We've got to find other sources of money to support this transition. We have big near-term barriers to clean resource deployment that we need to be looking at. We have more questions than answers at this point. And finally, we have unclear responsibility for enforcing planning goals, and we have fragmented decision-making occurring by individual buyers. So with that tall order in front of us, we look forward to working with the agencies and with the legislature and other stakeholders to try to find our way through this. And we are totally committed to getting to our 2030 goals and beyond. It's just going to be a lot of work. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you on this panel. Next, I'll open it up to questions from our committee members. Okay, Mr. Fong.
I don't have any specific questions. I would just want to, I guess, say, as someone who represents the Energy Capital California, I think some of the testimony is somewhat either inaccurate or just kind of inflammatory. Kern County produces 70% of California's oil. We produce 76% of California's natural gas. We also produce 60% of California's renewable energy. And so none of the goals that I've outlined in this hearing can be met without us. And so all I'm asking is for all of you on this panel to be pragmatic. We have to keep the lights on, and we have to ensure, as the chair says, the well-being of low-income families and families struggling in California to pay for the electricity bills. And oh, by the way, they got to fly around and they got to take their kids to school, and that requires them to put fuel in their cars. And so there's a false choice here when we can be pragmatic about how we power California, and which is now the fourth largest economy in the world. And so all I would say is that if you're going to model energy policy in California, you should do it all. And that includes petroleum and natural gas, because right now, if you look at Cal ISO's website, 33% of the power being generated right now is natural gas. And so we have a math problem, as indicated before. How do you make up the difference? And that's why Diablo Canyon was extended. That's why the Energy Commission is creating the strategic reserve, is because we live in reality and we have to keep the lights on. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Mr. Ting?
So just going back to, I think this, all three speakers sort of echo the same thing in terms of having a clean energy plan, moving closer to the goal. I think what we didn't hear was really greater details of how we do it. Just getting into the weeds. I mean, the reason we got to the stage we did last August wasn't because of lack of intentions or lack of desire of outlining what all three of you said. It was getting to a level of granularity, and I think our Mr. Fong kind of mentioned that, like in terms of how to achieve it, right? So if you can't figure out how to achieve it, you still need to keep the lights on. And so by what we decided to do was, keeping the lights on with temporary diesel generators and other temporary fossil. So I guess going back to all three of you, if you have other insights, I don't think I disagree with anything that you all said, but it didn't have many details that could really help us figure out what to do. Just going back to Mr. Breckel's point, that in an ideal world, we have one agency in charge. We don't have one agency in charge, but we actually have, a person in charge, and that's the governor. The governor's in charge, and the governor's office is in charge, and they are acutely, aware of this issue, and they're working on it. And all the agencies that set up here work for them, right? So I think what we are missing is the specifics of how we achieve it. How much storage is really realistic to get online the next 10, 20 years. Fuel cells, is that real in terms of technology, and can we scale it? In terms of natural gas, how much of it will we need? And I know that there's more energy efficient natural gas coming online as well. So all of these things, I think the high level is not what this hearing is supposed to be about. This hearing is really about getting down to brass tacks and getting down to details on what do we need to do, because that's ultimately the decision that we had to make in August, which was not an ideal decision. Keeping the OTCs going, keeping Diablo going, the strategic reserve from the previous year, really looking at diesel generation. That was not really that's the opposite of the direction that we have charted. So I think until you can come forward with some greater specificity, I can agree with your comments, but it doesn't get us any closer to achieving our goals. So feel free to respond if you'd like, but that's just a broad point for all three of you.
I think you've asked how much of a resource do we need to get to a particular set of goals. That was one of the things that you mentioned, Assemblymember. The modeling we've done is more than adequate. In fact, we seem to be so in love with modeling, we spend most of our time doing the forecasting and not enough time doing the actual heavy lifting and the work. The way to find out how much resource is available is to start directing entities to go buy it, or to have the state go out there and take the lead in doing that type of procurement. That's how you know. Now, is DWR going to be the leading edge of this? Are they actually going to go out and buy energy storage, or are they going to focus on resources that they hope to never use, which I find is somewhat of a questionable strategy. I would think we'd want to use public money to buy resources that we plan on using all the time. would seem to be a better way to do this. So I think that the answer in the near term is to start simply doing more. This might not be a very satisfying and prescriptive and specific recommendation, but doing more immediately is probably the first thing we want to do rather than doing a lot more studying of what kind of resources may or may not be available. The second thing I'm going to say is on the transmission issue and the interconnection. I do think it's a complicated issue, and part of what we're not seeing yet are the pinch points that need to be fixed. And I think a deeper dive into what those pinch points are and how to solve them. Is it the utilities that are slow walking? They're basically diverting personnel to work on other projects like wildfire mitigation. I can't sit here today and tell you that I have the answer. I can tell you that it's a good question that we need to look at. What does the CAISO need to do to fix its queue process so that we can move forward? I'm not sure. But I also think that increased emphasis on that question is worthy of our consideration. So I'm sorry that we don't have the silver bullets here. I think we're just trying to point you directionally into what the hurdles look like and where everybody needs to focus their attention going forward.
Yeah, I think CalISO doesn't know what to do to fix the problem either. That was clear. Going back to your point about doing more, so you're saying that the state should get involved in the energy procurement business, and we should be, because traditionally we haven't, right? Like you said, part of our strategic reserve is just to have a reserve. But are you saying that you recommend the state getting into the energy supply business?
Sorry. The state has been in the energy procurement business since the 2000 crisis through DWR, right? They were thrust into it in the middle of the emergency, and they stepped up and did a bunch of contracting. Mm-hmm. I'm not suggesting that DWR is the best vehicle for this. I'm pointing out that there are two ways to do it. One is you order all of the load-serving entities and the buyers out there to go buy things. The alternative is you do it yourself as the state. And I'm not sure that the state has made that choice or figured out how to navigate the tension between those two poles. The PUC has ordered load-serving entities to go out and buy stuff, but is it enough? Is it the right stuff? We're getting some information yet so far about what's coming in. Projects are getting delayed. More needs to be done. There's kind of a black hole in terms of publicly owned utilities and what they're doing, meaning the information isn't as readily available from a centralized source. So if we're going to do more, we should be doing more sooner. And if the state does want to play with state money through DWR, money that has perhaps already been appropriated by the legislature, I think focusing that on the highest value solutions that support the clean energy transition is something worth thinking about. And it would be great to have DWR here today, for example, to talk about what they're doing and answer some of these questions.
I would just add that I totally agree. I really think the main message from me is that we need to move from a reactive posture to a proactive posture. So it's about looking ahead far enough and procuring enough so that reasonably foreseeable delays, reasonably foreseeable cancellations of new resources are accounted for in the amounts that utilities are asked to go out and procure, or that the state is coming in to support in procurement. Also, there certainly are other states that take a more active and proactive role in transmission development. That the bill that was referenced earlier, Clean Air Task Force sponsored, SB 1032, Senator Becker's bill. And I do think there is a place for the state to be more forward-leaning on transmission, especially transmission that's going to unlock clean energy resources that we know the state will need and that are in the most ideal places. Also to unlock transmission that will allow for things like the open cycle once-through cooling turbines to be taken offline. That's principally a local generation and transmission challenge that has been stuck for a very, very long time because of a reactive stance in infrastructure and procurement policy.
Like Mr. Friedman identified or the need to study what the pinch points are, right, in terms of transmission development. And you, like what you've said, there isn't a point person. We've all worked, who should be identifying? Who should be directed to identify those pinch points and the barriers in our current structure?
Sure. In the current structure, I think the consumer advocate of the PUC has done a lot to identify what some of those pinch points might be. I think GoBiz is also quite active in that with the new financing authorities that they have. I think they're going to have to become pretty expert in how to get a transmission project done. So I think those would be the 2 points of emphasis I would place now.
And yeah, go ahead.
If I may follow up with Mr. Friedman, I think when we were debating the Strategic Energy Reserve before the Budget Committee, there was certainly a concern raised and a warning to the legislature that the reserve was designed to supplement in times of emergency. It was not to intervene and create disruption potentially in the energy market. And so I took that, of course, warning to heart. I was wondering if you had kind of a response. In just hearing you talk about the fact that you may want a little bit more government intervention in the state energy market, I would say that I would be hesitant on that, but I would like to get your perspective.
Thank you, Assemblymember. I think at the time, we did provide testimony to the legislature on this concept. And at the time, we noted that the idea of spending state money on physical hardware that never gets used is questionable. I mean, if you're going to go buy up all the diesel generators and stick them in a warehouse and hope that you never have to use them, was that the wisest use of state money when you could be spending it on stuff that you're actually using every single day, like storage? And the problem with storage has been that prices have escalated and there have been supply chain constraints. So maybe the state needs to overpay for storage. But maybe you end up getting an asset that you actually use for 10 or 20 years every single day, every hour of the day that provides value to the grid rather than a bunch of generators that sit doing nothing, literally just waiting to be called on. I think that was the critique. So the state's in it one way or another if the legislature agreed to appropriate money, which it did. So the question now is what to do with the money and how to get best value of it from it for all the customers in the state. So anyway, that's kind of where I was going.
Okay, but in terms of the procure or the production of energy, the general dynamics of all the players still produce. I mean, we do have enough a baseline load. I mean, with everything we've got, we just need to supplement it. Right? But in terms of replacement, I'm all for the need for more transmission lines. I guess I'm trying to understand if your focus is on, I mean, one of your missions is the ratepayer, then right now, as I indicated earlier, the ratepayer, because the customer is being asked to do a lot, and so I was, as indicated earlier, we're taking assets offline, which we probably shouldn't in the short medium term. I would say that probably we need them for the foreseeable future, just being realistic. And then there's not enough energy coming online. And then if the only response is demand on the demand side, I mean, you're asking, as you say, the customer to not only pay higher rates, but also to then use less electricity. So maybe you can respond to that as well.
Yeah, I think, in terms of the role for the state, I don't think the state should own generation. I don't think that's a good use of state money. I think the state financing and maybe owning transmission is a whole different thing because there's a lot of economic benefits associated with that. Generation is a competitive business, and there are a lot of companies out there that know how to build, own, and operate these resources, and I don't see that we want to change that. What do we want customers to do? The gas plants are going to stay online until we don't need them anymore. That's kind of the way it's all set up, where every year or every couple of years, if there's a reliability crunch, whether the state wants to or not, the California ISO can require those plants to stay online and simply pay them and force us all to pay the costs. And that's probably what's going to happen unless and until they're no longer needed. And how do we get there? I mean, a lot of it is storage right now. There's a lot of generation online, but it's producing at times that aren't the times that we necessarily need it. So shifting that is really the game right now. How far can we go with storage, and how much cheaper is storage going to get in the future years after we get through the supply crunch? So the other thing would be looking at transmission improvements to go into the local areas that are constrained right now, where you have the need to operate those gas plants because of a transmission constraint. Literally, you just can't import enough. How do we deal with that? Ultimately, in the long run, I think this will be good for ratepayers. In the short run, we're dealing with a lot of costs on the system that are driving up rates that actually aren't related to this transition. They're more related to things like wildfires, which was not part of the state's plan. It's just something that's happening, and we're trying to figure out how to get through it. So I don't know if this is helpful, but just some reactions.
Any other comments?
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, if I may just speak to a few different things that I've been hearing. Totally agree with other folks mentioning that there is not really a silver bullet solution, unfortunately, but there are many little pieces that, little and big pieces that can be improved and strengthened. I think I'll just say kind of along the lines of more storage and just thinking about more strategic use of storage. I know I mentioned community solar and storage, and I think, although again, nothing is a silver bullet solution, community solar and storage is unique in that it can avoid some of the issues that utility scale has, although of course we need more utility scale, but because it's on the distribution level, community solar projects can avoid some of the kind of the land use and permitting kind of bigger strains that sometimes the utility scale projects have, and can also follow on a faster timeline. So hearing from a lot of our solar developer partners that again can really get projects online quickly by 2024 or even 2025, as long as we get this program, set up and running. So going to the sense of urgency point that we really want to see through our state agencies. In addition, I know a few folks have mentioned the integrated resource plan proceeding and how there's this new procurement program that's currently, being created and under consideration. I think this is also, a really important step forward to ensuring that we have our loads, because, in terms of energy procurement, the state, the commission, the Public Utilities Commission does oversee the load serving entities' integrated resource plans. However, there aren't really strong compliance measures for LSEs, so we've often seen them not really procuring enough clean energy to meet the climate commitments that we've all created as a state. And so I know many barriers have been mentioned, but in addition to kind of addressing those barriers through research and better coordination, I think just even having a more a clearer process through the IRP to track the greenhouse gas reductions is currently being considered. So I'm just elevating that as something that, again, SEHA has been involved in, and I know numerous other parties. And I think I had one other point, but I'm now forgetting it. So those are the two I'll say right now. But again, just wanted to elevate I remembered it now. So just along this, I know Assemblymember Fong had mentioned a few times that, we can't rely on consumers to, voluntarily just on their own time conserve energy or be responsible for something when this is a systemic problem. To that point, I did mention the ELRP earlier, which will pay low-income customers to reserve their energy use, and just want to elevate again that this program could have gone a lot further this past heat wave, but there has been really, really low and poor coordination communication from not only the CAISO but also from utilities, and so we really want to mention that we can stand this program up and see it go much further while also bringing much needed bill savings to folks who are struggling to pay their bills right now. So it really is a win-win for us. And in addition to the ELRP, I think just want to elevate that if we're gonna kind of use the framing of let's not let reliability fall on communities. We have to think about how we're every single day through our actions, we're letting the pollution impacts fall on communities. And so definitely hear the need to be pragmatic and to understand the suite of options that are at play. But we really need transparency in terms of the trade-offs that we make when we choose some energy resources over others, recognizing it's complex, but also recognizing that continuing a path of gas and diesel reliance and also some of the other energy sources that I mentioned, it's putting people in hospitals. So we really have to do more to ensure that we're making the trade-offs really clear and that we're being very intentional about how we are moving in the clean energy transition.
Thank you. Any other questions from the panel? No, I agree. I mean, when you mentioned the ELRP program, unfortunately, we always have challenges doing outreach and communications to people that will benefit from that are willing to enroll in these programs. And I've seen that across the board on a lot of programs that that the PUC and others manage, right, or administer? And how do we get it out there to the communities? Do you have any ideas on how we can do that?
Oh, yes, definitely. Well, with so many of these programs, as you mentioned, there's a lot of great opportunities for communities to take advantage of. However, one of the barriers that is often mentioned is just not only the barriers that I think many of us are familiar in terms of lacking resources and time to be, fully, to be attending so many of these hearings and knowing about the different programs that are available. There's also sometimes a lack of trust because of, the history that some communities have with state institutions. And so that's why we at CEJA, we always encourage the coordination with community-based organizations to get out the message. But in addition to that, I think specifically to the ELRP, I know that there has been a desire to see that on the Flex alerts. I think from conversation with some folks, I think there was just a little bit of a discrepancy since the ELRP only applies to IOUs, and so maybe the Flex alerts didn't include that because it's statewide Flex alert. So I would love to continue that conversation because I think there's still a way we can include the suite of options that folks have, and ensure that is in the messaging that it's coming from the state. But yeah, beyond the ELRP and moving on to just general kind of recommendations, I would say definitely providing CBOs resources to do outreach and supporting communities to be aware of the different things that are available to them. And as mentioned by many folks, interagency coordination, because EJ advocates can only be in so many PUC proceedings with the resources that we have, and so when to the extent, and that's just an example, of course, there's many different types of proceedings and work that we do, but just mentioning the CPUC as an example because that's an area I'm more familiar with, and knowing that there's so many issues that are spread out across so many different areas, as we're all kind of noticing here today. I think the more that we can streamline, make things transparent and public and accessible to the average community member, the more that we can do that, the better. I know that it's tough because these topics are very technical and complex, but I think that there's so much more that we can do on that.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank all of the panelists for your testimony, for answering our questions. Thank you for joining us here today on this issue of identifying actions to get to our 2030 goals. Like we mentioned at the beginning of the hearing, this is not a one-time, one-and-done hearing. This is a continuing conversation, and a lot of you have identified issues that we need to continue working on, questions that we need to continue asking, and I really appreciate that. So thank you very much to all of you. Next, and I also want to thank everyone in the room that's still here for your patience, for engaging, for listening to the full hearing in person. But next, we'll move on to anyone that wants to provide public comment. As a reminder, we want to limit the public comment period to 1 minute per person. But thank you for joining us here today and for staying for the full hearing.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Daniel Broad on behalf of Sierra Club California. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment and for holding this hearing today. We know that as we transition away from fossil fuels, we must also keep the lights on, especially as the worsening climate crisis threatens grid reliability. However, as we heard from CEJA today, the state cannot continue to put the burden of reliability on the environment and on already overburdened communities by propping up fossil fuel infrastructure, continuing to delay the retirement of once-through cooling, and overutilizing dirty diesel backup generators. This session, we look forward to working with the legislature to further advance distributed energy resources, battery and long-duration storage, energy efficiency, and demand response programs. And while transportation electrification is going to increase energy demand, the ever-growing population of light and heavy-duty battery electric vehicles can also enhance grid reliability through bidirectional capabilities. And finally, we hope to have as many of these conversations as possible through actual policy bills this session that can move through the entire legislative process. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
members of the committee of the three committees that were here today. Jeremy Smith here on behalf of the State Building and Construction Trades Council. We are chagrined that very little was said today about the workers in the industries whose jobs will be affected by the transition ideas that were discussed today. We have a unique perspective on climate change and the transition to new energy. Our members have fought for the entitlements and then have built the vast majority of the state's utility-scale solar, wind, geothermal, pump storage, and other renewable sources of energy. Most of these entitlements were hard fought, fighting the same activists locally that are currently demanding the state cease traditional power and energy production. At the building trades, we believe in climate change, but appreciate Assembly Member Fong's comments about being pragmatic. However, our members seek a realistic approach to the climate crisis that embraces science and common sense solutions that also supports our workforce and does not price working families like their own out of California. Our members have trained for years to do exactly what they want to do, be construction workers, many of whom work in the current energy production sector now. What they do not want is to be retrained to be anything other than a tradesperson. It is a mistake to think that they want any job other than the one they were trained for. Finally, we fully expect our industrial workers to remain industrial workers as we move to fully meet the climate crisis, and we ask policymakers to keep this in mind as we talk about the need for a transition of our energy production.
Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members. Vince Warat-Maja with the Climate Center. Since most of today's conversation focused on utility scale, I do want to uplift Vice Chair Gunda's and Seha's and Sierra Club's comments about using EVs to provide grid stability and prevent future blackouts. We're seeing this idea take hold in the mainstream, especially when seeing Ford actively market it as a major feature in their electric F-150. The state currently has a goal of 5 million EVs by 2030. If we were to achieve that goal, we will have enough batteries on wheels to power every home in the state for a full day. And one thing to note on that front, we're expected to exceed that goal by a wide margin, 8 million vehicles given the current market trends. This would get us through all the peaks that we keep hearing about and that will continue happening because of the climate-driven extreme heat events. To tap into this massive potential, the state needs to do everything it can to accelerate the adoption of VGI. We need to make sure that these vehicles have the hardware, software, and price signals needed to make significant contributions to the grid, all of which can and must be driven by the policy set by the legislature. These could include mandating that every electric vehicle sold in the state be capable of putting electrons onto the grid, as well as leveraging budget dollars, including the SB 846 money that's been agreed to incentivize the adoption of VGI capabilities in both ZEVs, as well as the charging infrastructure that benefit from state funding. One other critical thing to note, using these resources would avoid the development uncertainties and long permitting times associated with utility scale projects, which of course are still needed. Finally, all of these policies must ensure that frontline communities are the first beneficiaries to benefit from these technological advances. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. John Kennedy with the Rural County Representatives of California. I'm really glad we're having this discussion today because locals are really experiencing a lot of these issues and trying to figure out how we get to the state's energy goals, how we get to the state's climate change goals. So two brief issues. The first is reliability. We have folks just 30 miles away from us in Sacramento that don't have reliable electricity, and that's not acceptable today. And second is the ability to serve even normal economic growth in communities. So reliability isn't just about the threat of rolling blackouts. We've had over 2,000 fast trip outages over the last 7 or 8 months throughout the state. Those outages, an average about 4 to 6 hours, but as long as 10 to 20 hours, have a really disruptive impact on schools, on low-income families, on businesses, on workers. So it's a quality of life issue throughout the state. Some circuits have gone down 20 times over the last 6 months or so. So we need to figure out how we can reduce the number of these outages and provide safe and reliable and affordable electricity. And then with respect to connections, I agree we need to look at transmission. We need to look at more energy procurement, but we also need to get the smaller scale infrastructure projects finished. We have long had problems with getting power to new projects. We're often told it's 2 to 4 years before the utility can come in and do the system upgrades necessary to bring a new manufacturing facility online. A new food processing facility in Fresno County had major problems, and their alternative is diesel backup generators. That's not acceptable today. The North Coast is having huge problems, 5 to 7 year delays in getting the infrastructure upgraded so they can expand hospital access, so they can build a new distribution facility. So these are the problems we're seeing from an economic development perspective, from a normal growth perspective, but we're also seeing them frustrate the state's ability to electrify the vehicle fleet, to decarbonize industrial processes. So I want to bring that to your attention. Would love to work with you on solutions to that because we think that the local governments working with utilities, working with the state can make it happen. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Well, we have concluded our agenda. This was a joint hearing between the Assembly Committees on Natural Resources, Utilities and Energy, and Budget Sub 6. I want to thank my fellow chairs, Mr. Ting and Mr. Garcia, for planning this hearing, and all the staff that worked on it. And thank you, Mr. Fong, for joining us today. So this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.